welcome to episode 113 of Killer POV. Witches. I am Rob G. I'm one of your co-hosts, Rob G. Sitting with me is Elric Kane.
Hello.
Other co-host 3, Rebekah McKendry.
I'm co-host number 3.
Number 3.
No credits. No credits today.
I will henceforth be known as co-host 3.0.
That's it. We are the Voltron of co-hosts.
And I'll form the head.
Hey now. Welcome to the episode. We've got a really great one for you. The guest actually is somebody that we've been trying to have on for a little while. Very excited about it. And he's the showrunner and creator of Salem, which we've been talking about quite a bit the last several months. And he's a good friend of Rodman Flender, who was a guest and a friend of the show's. He did Idle Hands, and he directed this week's episode of Scream.
Oh, has it played yet? What day is that?
Yep, it already played earlier this week.
Okay, cool. So, I'm up to date besides that.
I'm 1 or 2 episodes behind, but I'm very happy for Rodman. And then Ty West, I guess, directs the next one.
The last one before Rodman's was by the girl who did Honeymoon.
Yes, that's true.
I kind of love that, even though that I've heard it's a very contemporary show and that it's definitely for a different generation.
I dig it.
It's
but I love that they're using these kind of vet horror directors.
I'd love to find out who's running the show and why they made that choice, because that is a great choice.
Yeah.
I mean, it's certainly elevating stuff a little bit. I mean, I'm not totally hooked, but I watch it and go, oh, that's all right. And so I don't know what it is. It'll wait till like the A storyline starts to really hook me.
Yeah.
But there's something about it. Like, you know who I like? I like the nerd guy. The guy.
He's great.
Yeah. Somebody told me he listens to our show.
Get out of here, really?
No
Somebody told us like about 3 or 4 episodes he's friends with someone we know.
I thought somebody tweeted it. Like
yeah, somebody I met in real life.
I don't know
if you're listening. No, if you're listening to the show, you're a guest. So, you're invited.
Anytime.
Message us on Facebook.
Because
we'd love to have you on.
Anyone who plays a geek in a show should also be able to talk the talk on the show.
That's true.
No, but if he does listen, that makes him like way badass, because then he's not only on a horror show, but he's like a fan.
He just trumped Jamie Kennedy.
Yeah, he did.
This is true. Hard to do.
Jamie Kennedy.
We need to reference Killer POV on Scream, and then
shit, that would be all over. Yeah,
then it's on.
Okay, so I only saw a couple things, but what did you guys see this week? Anything exciting, Elric?
Okay. Well, I listened to. I'm still doing this podcast thing. Projection Booth tackled my favorite movie of last year, Under the Skin.
Okay.
It's a good solid 2.5 hour talk. Really interesting. There's a podcast out there that I'd never heard of. I guess it's popular in Canada, kind of like our show, called Faculty of Horror. And one of the woman from that, it's kind of academics on horror. She was the guest. And they basically discussed and kind of analyzed the movie. But then they had a really good interview with the original screenwriter who wrote like 3 or 4 drafts. It took, these are things I didn't know. Jonathan Glazer worked on getting that to the screen for 13 years.
Wow.
From the time he found the book and went through lots of iterations. That's why it's so different from the book. The writer stuck pretty close to the book, and the book has basically farms where they're, have the men and they're going to eat them. So it's a lot more literal. So he was quite surprised by the direction Glazer actually ended up going, even though he wrote a couple scripts for Glazer. Just fascinating just to kind of hear the process of all the iterations a movie can go through. And that he said when he wrote it, it went to, all the Hollywood kind of bigwigs, and every studio he went to would just rave about how much they loved this as a script. And it would always be the spec script that they would introduce him anywhere. And they'd always say to him, oh, but it'll never get made. Just so you know, we all love this. And he had this really, I've never heard this about Hollywood. He usually you hear, no one reads. In his case, he said, actually, he's British. He goes, actually, all the people who run all the studios, they all tend to actually have incredible taste and be incredibly smart. They're all into great art house movies and stuff. He goes, but they're not idiots. They've basically been trained to, make money, to make the business. And they actually, they all have Harvard and Yale educations and like good movies, but that's not what they're going to make. And that's why he kind of said with that film, that's why it took a long time and ended up. So that was really interesting. And the more I thought about it, it actually propelled me, talking about Glazer, propelled me to rewatch Sexy Beast a couple days ago, which I always loved, but I forgot it's really one of the most perfect little movies. It's just a fantastic gangster film. And it made me realize he's only made 3 films and they're all kind of perfect. Then he made Birth, and then he made Under the Skin. And I mean, perfect on kind of a technical level.
Yeah.
Birth, story-wise, is a little funky. You know, it's a little strange, but it's beautiful to look at. But each film's like 8 years apart, you know, or 5 or 6 years apart. So it'd be interesting to see where he goes next. So anyway, I highly recommend the podcast. If you, like me, you loved that film, or even you didn't love the film, but you're interested in where they go. They spend a lot of the time on the air reading a review by someone called Horror Hooch. And he basically reduces the movie like, oh, when are we going to see Scarlett's tits? And then this happens. He's basically watching it like just with that in mind. And it's pretty, you see the real difference in how people can watch movies, you know? And so that was, I don't know, I thought it was a good episode. But the cool one, the cool kind of find I did on my Code Red kick, I'd heard of the film Ghost Keeper a long time ago. I'd never seen it. I watched it last night, and it's a really interesting movie. It's a, you know, part of Connexploitation, Canadian. It's basically, that's what I wrote down.
Interesting.
Interesting.
As I made a quick note, I wrote Shining by Ty West, but Canadian. So that's my note, because it literally feels like The Shining is trying to evoke The Shining. It's this little lodge in the middle of the snow in Canada. Some people who ride those like snowmobiles kind of, hey, why don't we go this way instead of that way? And they come to this little isolated hotel, and they go inside. You think there's no one there. It's kind of got a haunted vibe. And then they see some crazy old lady, and she talks about how her sons are going to be around soon. They're going to spend the night because it's too cold outside. And then out of nowhere, you realize they're looking after a Wendigo in the basement that they've been, and I guess that's what the Ghost Keeper, I guess they are classifying Wendigo as a ghost, because I guess it is a spirit. But it was one of those movies where you sit down to watch it if you know nothing, and you go, oh, Ghost Keeper, so it's about a ghost, and then suddenly they're mentioning a Wendigo, and then it's kind of a slasher film, and then by the end you're just like kind of scratching your head a bit. Right. But it's a slow burn. I honestly will be shocked to find out if Ty has never seen this movie. There's something about it that makes me think he saw that and then just made House of the Devil. It has kind of similarities to a lot of that. He might not have. It is pretty obscure. Wow. But it's, you know, it's definitely, it's not like one where I'd go, you must pay $40 to see this movie. I'm like, if somebody's going to hand you the copy, definitely worth watching. Right. It's got some nice vibes to it. It's clever. But the Wendigo thing looks pretty cool, but they really never go into it. I mean, literally you see a couple shots of this thing like being kept in almost a cellar, and that's it. And I'm like, And I guess the myth goes that an old woman's meant to look after a Wendigo, and then it's passed on to another woman. Right? That's not a myth I've ever heard.
So the slasher element is not the Wendigo?
Not really. I mean, so no, it's the people looking after. It's the Ghost Keeper. That's the slasher element. But if you like films from that era, it's definitely worth checking out. And I liked it.
Is this 70s or 80s?
No, I think it's 80s. I think it's like early 80s. I think it's like 82. It was definitely after The Shining. But the guy claims he didn't copy The Shining. He just had a cool location. Somebody said, hey, we've got this place for you to shoot. But yeah, it's worth watching. It has some cool interviews on it. But I love these movies where I don't know. I mean, literally, I saw the cover of this thing and the title, and I was like, okay, you know. And so you really, I guess that also kind of throws you off, because you go, oh, Ghost Keeper is going to be a ghost and kind of haunting movie, and it has that setup, and then you just see this crazy thing in the basement. You're like, oh, that's cool, but it doesn't fully fulfill it. But but you know. Still, check out those Code Red titles. I love how I'm giving these guys plugs and I don't even know them. Though.
Yeah, check out Code Red.
I can just lend you this one.
No, there's quite a few I want to check out. About it.
Yeah, I don't think I want to buy this one. I'll just borrow your copy.
I don't think you need to own it unless you're a completist, but I did like it.
Most of us are completists. Bekah, what'd you say?
Well, right now I'm mesmerized by Elric's shirt, by the way.
Yes.
Have you?
I'm trying to up the ante every week.
They get louder and louder every week.
This
is my favorite shirt.
When he first walked in, I told him it looked like he had like pot leaves all over it. But now that I'm looking at it, it looks like he's being attacked by sea anemones.
That's right.
Clearly, they are like attacking him.
Don Johnson wasn't even bold enough to wear this. That's actually my favorite of all of them. So
it's kind of remarkable. Yeah. But anyway, this week I watched, and this is a weird one for me, Old Dark House, which is 1932. James Whale, the guy who did Frankenstein. Yeah, it's Karloff.
I haven't seen that in a long time.
You know, and it's kind of a stranger role for him. And it's kind of the original Dark House film, I'll call it, where there's a storm going on and two groups of people end up getting stuck there because there's flooding outside and the power's going out and all this stuff. And what they find is, and this is kind of a weird family structure, so pardon me if I slaughter it, it is a very old dad, two sons, a daughter who are also all old, and then the butler who is played by Boris Karloff. And they find out that one of the sons is like this crazy pyromaniac who's been trying to break out and burn the house down. And everyone else is just kind of nuts too. And then Boris Karloff's character keeps getting drunker and drunker as the movie goes on. And yeah, it's just kind of the original. It's a comedy. It's very kind of what you would expect from a comedy in 1932. It's almost kind of vaudevillian. But
So is this
works.
before or after Frankenstein? I'm losing my timetable.
What year was Frankenstein? I think it
if
was.
it's 30s after, I think
Yeah.
it's late 20s.
No, because I've never seen it, but it's often referred to as one of James Whale's best. Like when people talk about him, they always mention Old Dark House.
Yeah.
So I was curious about it.
I would assume it's after Frankenstein. I'm looking it up right now.
Oh,
I will
really?
still say that.
I'm going to say it is, but I could be wrong.
Yeah,
Prove me
I'm
wrong.
gonna
Someone at
say-
home is screaming that knows the date already. I know.
Yeah, somebody's like freaking out. How do you not know the date?
How do you guys have a show
Frankenstein
if
was
you don't know
made?
that?
We don't memorize the old stuff from before we were born.
The original Frankenstein, 1931.
Sorry,
so this was the
this
was
is the
his-
next year. So this would
It
likely
was
be
his-
like one of his next films.
Yeah,
Right,
so they probably
that
worked
makes
together a
sense.
few times. Yeah.
And this is drastically different from Frankenstein tone-wise. This is clearly a comedy. Everyone in it is very, it's almost Mousetrap-like. I mean, obviously, this is what Mousetrap would have been based off of. But it follows that same kind of everyone in it is an over-the-top caricature of, okay, you're going to be the peppy secretary. You're going to be the military man. You're going to be the drunk style.
Right, like Clue or something.
Yeah.
James Whale was a very good director. You know, just as a technician. I love that movie about him too, Gods and Monsters. That's a really nice, touching film.
And this one, it feels, the house is not like a mansion. I mean, it's big, but it's not. A lot of times when you see these old Dark House movies, it's just this like vacuous, endless wings upon wings where you never really know where you are or how the house is structured. This is surprisingly a smaller house. So the kind of geography of it is nicely laid out. So I highly recommend it. Don't exactly watch it expecting it to be Shaun of the Dead. It's not that type of horror comedy. It's not comedy that we're used to anymore, but it's got some really fascinating stuff in it. It's cool to see Boris Karloff in this too. I also, and I will admit, I only made it halfway through because I started it last night after like a 10-hour day at the Blumhouse factory. And so I only made it like halfway through before I started falling asleep. But I want to finish it. The Editor, which is new from Scream Factory. And it played at Beyond Fest last year. And I missed it when it played there, but I really wanted to see it. This is from the Astron 6 guys.
That's right.
And it's fascinating and it's fun, but it is for such a precise audience. And I have to say, I think Elric mentioned before the show started that he thought it went on a little bit too long.
Yeah, I like the precision. The precision is what makes it worthwhile. Like if you've watched a lot of Giallos, I remember it's like the first 30 minutes, my jaw dropped at some of the references because they were so like, I mean, it was literally like, oh, that's lizard in a woman's skin. And that's Strange Vice of Missive Art, like literal jokes. But man, I think, well, it has this thing where one of the kind of protagonists, and it's not because he dies or anything, is really featured, you know, the editor, it's called The Editor, early in the film for the first half. And then the second half, it kind of goes off on another tangent for like literally another half a movie. And I remember really feeling like that's where it lost me. It's just one of those stories that because it's kind of a satire and it's kind of, you know, jokes rather than a movie at a certain point. I remember whoever I went with hated, I think it was Mike Williamson. I think it was the film he hated most all year. I remember him just raving about it afterwards. He was so
I figured
rabid.
It would be so niche and so kind of wink, wink, get it
Think
on
of the
something
jokes.
so precise that he would like it.
Most of the crowd really liked it. I know Steven Scarlato, who was on our show not long ago. I remember him. That was one of his favorites, he said, of the year. And it really is funny. I mean, the jokes are great. It's just sometimes that's not enough to hang a whole movie on. You know?
And you really do have to know Giallo films because, I mean, there was stuff in there that I could say, I think that's referencing something.
Right, because
it
feels
what,
specific. Yeah.
But there's something it's got to be referencing. But then there were other things that I was like, hey, I get it. Like there's a couple of shots that are direct carbon copies of shots from The Beyond.
Yeah.
And so if you've seen The Beyond a lot, you can go like, oh my God, that's brilliant. That's hilarious. But yeah, it's so.
I bet if it was 30
niche.
minutes, it'd be like the greatest film ever, like greatest comedy sketch ever. And it's just at 90 minutes or 100, it's like, you know.
I still want to check it out though.
You'll like it. I think it's
Pushes
fun.
on a bit long. I want to finish it just because I want to see where it was going. But yeah, that point that you were talking about where it kind of shifts into a different plot, I started getting tired and then I had to turn it off.
It also just depends what you like. Even the top 20 list that everyone was sending around, the top 21, it's kind of like, is Cabin in the Woods or something else? It's kind of like, or is What We Do in the Shadows the best film of the year? Or is it someone? It's kind of like, what kind of horror are you looking for?
Yeah.
You know, if comedy horror is then those are perfect.
Yeah.
You know, if you want to get scared, then they're not
different
perfect.
stuff.
Yeah.
But-
So it's just like what we place in these categories.
I was looking at that list, and underneath the comments, one of the second comments that somebody wrote was, "What we do in the shadows was an absolute piece of garbage." And I was suddenly like,
Right.
you know what? Some people don't love it as much as
Yeah.
I do.
Yeah,
and I
some
got to
People
think
have no
about
sense
that.
of humor.
No, it's true. It's like
But-
we're all looking for different things.
And
Yeah.
I mean, but I know people who think that the Scary Movie or the A Haunted House series are just like the most hilarious things ever made. And I can watch
You know
those.
someone like that?
I
Yeah,
do.
yeah.
I've never
I
met
know.
anyone.
You know, when they first started coming out and I was still in college, there were people in like my circle of friends who never watched horror films but would gather and watch those and thought that they were the best things in
That's
the world.
interesting.
And for me, they were always just like groans. And it
Yeah.
was such sophomoric humor that never really appealed to me. But there were people who loved them, and they have to be. They keep making them. I
Well,
mean,
they were
obviously
made
they're
by
turning
people
profits.
who clearly didn't love those movies,
Yeah.
and that's the difference. Like if they love those movies and then were but these were people going out. That's what made a lot of money. Let's take them down.
Spoof it, yeah.
You know?
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know. Every time I've interviewed the Wayans before, they've always been like, "We love horror," and I
We
mean,
love making money off.
Yeah,
Horror
no,
fan.
that's right. Well, I've got two really quick ones here. The first one I'm holding in my hands right now. It is a Blu-ray for a new movie. New. Let me specify new because they're trying to sell it as not new. But it's called Lost After Dark. It's a Canadian slasher. The credits all went back to Canada. But anyway, the whole reason I bring that up is because it's got a very retro style cover. And
Looks like the Mutilator to me. The cover.
it's
the
got like a
tagline.
mutilated cover.
I like the tagline.
The tagline is, "And you thought the 80s were dead." So that's number one. And all the quotes, the quote right here from Culture Crypt says, "Retro 80s horror done right." Okay. And then on the back from Dread Central, it says, "The best 80s slasher film that wasn't filmed in the 80s." So the only reason I'm making such a big point of this is because they want me to go into this thinking I'm going to see a really great 80s style horror movie.
Right.
Okay. I did not think that at all. This comes out from Anchor Bay on September 1st. It's coming out soon. And initially, my initial reaction is because the director is this guy named Ian Kessner, and I don't know him. I don't know what his intent was with the movie, but maybe he grew up liking slasher films and wanted to do something that paid homage to it. So my initial reaction watching it was like, okay, I've seen this all before because I've seen a million 80 slashers. But what bothered me was almost immediately there's kind of like the pops and scratches on on the film, and
Which
like,
are added in post.
Yeah,
It's not like he filmed it like Ty West style.
Yeah, it's the grindhouse thing, which immediately turns me off. It's like, no. Don't try to be an 80s movie. Just make a film that evokes that.
I call that the Blanc bean filter.
Do they do that on their movies? I don't know.
Whatever the one Michael directed, The Victim. It's
The
just
Victim,
all
is
of that
that
like
what it
Yeah,
that.
is?
it's
Yeah.
all over it.
And I get that. That's fine. But that's not, I don't know. I don't see that and think, oh, 80s slasher, because it looks like it was the film is shitty and doesn't, has been played a lot. But like Robert Patrick's in this. He's like the one name of it. And the characters are okay. The acting's fine. And once like it gets going, like, a bunch of kids are skipping prom to go party, and they break down by a house, and the house is the killer. It's like by the numbers, sort of typical. Like there's nothing new to it all. The killer kind of looks like Rob Zombie, which also bothered me because I'm like, oh, they didn't even give him like a cool mask or a look or anything. He just looks like Hobo Zombie.
Hobo Zombie.
And the best benefit I can give it, because even like the kills weren't all that extraordinary, but I was like, all right, at least the order of the characters getting killed is kind of surprising. Like at least they're spacing it out like that. But I told Bekah, because I was willing to give this movie the benefit of the doubt and at least a pass for like, all right, at least you're trying or something. But halfway in the movie, one of the characters is about to get killed, and it stops and says, "Film reel missing." And I literally got up and said, "Fuck you."
Oh, yeah.
Now you've totally lost me. I get trying to be an 80s movie, but when you pull a gimmick like that,
Yeah.
no, not at all.
Did they show the death, or is it totally missing?
No, I mean, okay, so the point of it, and I'm sorry, this is mild spoiler territory, but not really. My guess is the point of it is to let you wonder for a little longer if that character got killed or not. Like, I get the gimmick of it, but it doesn't work as well as in, say, Planet Terror from Grindhouse, where they cut it and then it comes back and it's a great comedic beat because he's like, had you not just told me what you told me, I wouldn't have known to hate you this whole time.
Right.
It's like, well, what was it? It doesn't matter. You just,
It's like that's in the writing of the script.
Exactly.
This might have
That's
just been
the point.
imposed, right?
So that really lost me and really infuriated me. And then not too long after that, they kill a dog, and it really upset me because it wasn't and it just felt so out of context. So I get that they're trying to make an 80s movie, but I think they failed. The way that you make an 80s movie is you're somebody like Ty West that has that aesthetic.
Right.
He didn't need to put, pops in the film reel for House of the Devil for it to feel like an 80s movie.
Right.
And same thing for Malevolence, the original Malevolence that Stephen Mena did. And it bums me out because Anchor Bay I used to trust. Like there was a period where they would put out films like, The First Hatchet and then Behind the Mask and The Lost. And it's like every time they put one out, I was like, oh, that's going to be a cool thing. And now it's like I'm skeptical anytime Anchor Bay puts something out.
Yeah.
Right.
And this is the reason why, because this is not for me because I've already seen every 80s slasher. Now, that said, if I'm a 16-year-old kid and I've never seen 8 million movies from the 80s, I may put this on and be like, that was really cool. Man, that was awesome. So I
often try to think like that, but then I watch the movies and go, I still don't think they will.
And this one, and granted, I have not seen this yet, but even just what Rob was telling me when he was telling me about it before, it bothered me because it's obviously really trying to reference 80s movies. 80s would be VHS culture.
Right. Yeah.
And why it's got the pops and scratches and the real missing would be mid-70s grindhouse culture.
Right.
So
Yeah,
it's kind of an interesting, not very cohesive mix of decades.
I might have been into it if they did some weird VHS kind of gags in it, because then I'm like,
that's
all
what
right.
it would need is like the glitches and the skips that you'd see on a VHS tape. That would be something that's a little bit more 80s.
There was one that marketed itself the same way, and I really wanted to see it. Beautiful cover. You'll probably remember it if you saw it. But then I watched the trailer, and it kind of looked like, oh, this is bullshit. Is that one called The Sleeper from like a year or two ago? Had this awesome cover, and it did the same thing. It plugged itself as it was going to be this great 80s slasher film, and I was so close to just buying it, online because it looked so freaking good. And then I watched the trailer, and it just looked, kind of like shot on HD, and
I do
it was really
the
trying
cover
to show Rob the cover.
80s.
I think you definitely would have seen this cover. It was, it was definitely something they were trying to hype. And it looked really cool.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I remember.
And it looks great.
Cover,
like, I would watch that just
never
based on the cover. Had that been in the 80s, I would have rented it.
Yeah, and that's fine. But, you know, whatever. I mean, even like the dad character had like a mustache and was kind of a little, you can't try to be an 80s movie. You just have to do something natural for it to fall into that.
So if you start reaching for, what is it, Lost After Dark, as your hand starts reaching for that button, instead push the Kathy's Curse button on your ordering form
Brian
and get
Collins
a real movie.
Just like pinged from
Kathy's
that.
Curse.
Yeah,
you heard it here.
Look, I'm curious what other people would think. Now, if they agree with me or they think I'm crazy about it. But that's my 2 cents. And really, really quickly, because honestly, I like this movie washed over me to the point that I don't comprehend it, but I just got Nomads from 1986.
Oh my God, I fucking love that movie.
Never even heard of it before. Never seen it.
Funny.
Scream Factory just put it out. It's available now. It stars Pierce Brosnan, who I love, and it's written and directed by John McTiernan, who, Die Hard.
He's amazeballs.
Yeah, Predator.
He's amazeballs.
No, he's an amazing director, and I thought it was fascinating. I mean,
But he taps phones.
it's really weird that Pierce Brosnan is playing a Frenchman in it. I thought that was kind of funny and odd, but it has a weird surrealistic quality that I had a really tough time following the narrative because, not a spoiler, but technically his character dies right in the opening scene, but whispers something to the doctor that's helping, the female doctor that's helping him. So she, for the remainder of the movie, keeps having flashbacks of his memory. So you kind of see him being like, he's like a photographer, and he's going after like these weird kind of motorcycle punk looking people through Los Angeles.
The gutter punks.
They're like gutter punks, but then it's like, wait, are they really there? Are they angels or whatever? It's just like a weird surrealistic quality to it that there were certain things about it I was really digging and liking, and the way it was like directed, but the narrative, and I was watching it late last night to the point where when it ended, I was like, what just happened? I don't get it.
Rob, I have to challenge you on this one.
Sure.
I will tell you, when I was a kid, I watched that movie.
Yeah.
On
Did you
VHS.
get it as a kid?
I thought it was absolute rubbish.
Are you serious?
I really did. I remember watching that movie on VHS thinking, wow, this looks cool, and going, what the hell was that? I remember very clearly that memory of just going, I don't get what this movie was.
I did not see Nomads until high school, but I absolutely loved it and always had. I owned the novelization to Nomads.
Get out of here.
I kid you not.
I would rewatch it just because I'm curious. I just remember out of all those VHS, I think I rented it multiple times, and each time I was like, what?
See, I'd be curious for you to see it now with your tastes as they are now, because it definitely seems
because you
like...
guys haven't even really given the plot yet, which is that he's...
What plot?
He's an anthropologist investigating like cultures, like groups and cultures, nomadic cultures. And then he gets into this kind of homeless population in this city and he's following them. And then he finds out that they're in, kind of otherworldly and then the secrets and everything. And that's the plot.
Sometimes it's funny. Sometimes the more art house ones that you would think on paper I like, it's like The Sender was one that people would recommend recently. And visually there was some great stuff in it, but it's still, if they're still not that hooked to get you in. I think that's the thing. I think once you're in, once you get your audience hooked in the story, can be in the first few minutes, you can really kind of throw anything visually at them. But if you're not hooked, you're just kind of watching the screen. You know what I mean? And I find that with quite a lot of these movies where you're like, I don't get it. You don't want to be confused. That's the thing. I like abstract, but I don't like being confused.
Well, I don't know why we just didn't follow Pierce the entire time.
Right.
Like, I don't know why we had to go through his memory in this other girl's body. Like, it's just bizarre. But
I want to hear what our fans think of this one, because Elric didn't like it. I loved it, and Rob's confused.
I will rewatch.
Nomads.
I'm going to Nomads.
I want to hear what you think. Yeah.
It gets 1 in 0.2 or something on our score.
Alrighty. Well, stand by, and we are going to bring our guest on.
And cupcakes.
All right, so welcome back. We are sitting here with a very special guest, somebody that we wanted to have on the show for quite a bit. He is currently the showrunner and the co-creator,
co-creator, but I prefer creator.
Creator.
Just the creator.
Demiurge.
Of the show Salem, which we've been talking about quite a bit in the last several episodes. Also worked for Roger Corman quite a bit. Did Brain Dead, a little movie called Carnosaur.
I didn't know that part.
Buzz Wallach, our friend Buzz, is a huge fan. I promised I would get this signed for him, so I have Carnosaur right here for you, Buzz. Don't worry. Also, really terrific documentary that I didn't realize this guy made called The American Nightmare from around 2000.
Which is phenomenal. And I have to say, one of the reasons that I kind of started pursuing horror, because at the time when I first saw that, I was a school teacher teaching English and film in Virginia. And I watched that, and that was one of the things that made me say, I don't want to be doing this, I want to be doing that. And I moved to New York the next year. It was all like a series of events, but that was a very pivotal one. I got that documentary for Christmas from my parents.
Wow. Which also makes you the creator of this podcast.
Yes!
Adam, you are our creator.
Welcome, Adam Simon, to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you could see me, you'd see I'm turning bright red. Or else I was bright red.
And, it's funny that one of the main reasons, again, I was saying before you came on that you just kind of out of nowhere, like Bekah started watching Salem, and then Rodman, who's a big friend of our show and us, mentioned, he's like, I used to work with Adam in the Corman days. You should have him on. He'd be a great guest. He loves horror and all that stuff. So it's just funny how everything kind of lined up the way it did. And I was at the Brain Dead screening with him at the Cinefamily. I'd never seen the movie. For some reason, I thought I had, because I always remember
only
that
about
image.
37 people total. It's one of the things where more now claim they saw it.
Right.
And Peter Jackson saw it. He's still upset about the title.
He is still upset about the title.
But you do have a story about that, right?
Oh, really? I didn't know that there was a story behind it.
Well, there is, because we are the reason that Buried and Dead had to be
retitled Dead Alive.
Dead Alive, which is a terrible title for
a
film that I will openly admit is approximately 10,000 times better than mine. And we were at the same really fun, weird Italian horror fest called the Dylan Dog, which I don't think still exists, but based on this great Italian horror comedy. Exactly.
That was a good comic.
Was a great comic and has been at least one great movie and maybe one not so great one. I didn't see the other one.
Not so great.
But I did have to go up to him and apologize and they were actually doing the mini. It's an early death in your career when they do the mini retrospective. But all I had done was the Corman movies, but they were showing that and they were showing the double bill of Brain Dead and Carnosaur. They had left out Body Chemistry 2.
Was that a Shannon Tweed film?
Ooh, no, but it was in the cycle. It came along in the period after I forget there was a Strip to Kill, and there was a whole series of the Shannon Tweed ones. It was certainly during the heyday of the the erotic horror movie or whatever they call them, the erotic thriller. But yes, I did get down on my knees to apologize.
Stuff.
It was before there was Cinemax. That was probably what killed those movies.
Oh, wow.
And who needed to even bother to go to the video store when they would pipe it direct to your home?
Yeah, that's true. Well, let's start there, because I'm always fascinated by anything to do with Roger Corman or Charles Band.
Oh yeah,
always the best stories. So how did you fall into the Roger camp? Was Brain Dead technically the first thing you did for him?
Yeah, no, in that sense, I was lucky in that I think people, excuse me, like Rodman and a lot of other terrific people I can think of who came through there in our era, came to work for him on the business side or on the publicity side or in those things. And then a la Rodman, got, as he should have, the chance to, I think he produced a ton of movies for Roger before he got to do The Unborn, one of my favorite Corman movies. But somebody over in his little factory there had seen this kind of ghostly World War II short I had made at film school and had really liked it. And they had this crazy script called Paranoia that Charles Beaumont had written way back in the early 1960s, probably the last thing he wrote and left unfinished when he died of a disease that could have come out of his own fevered brain. He got this weird thing where I don't even know what the name is. It's creepyitis, where you age like
that's terrifying.
Okay, kids, that's not actually the name.
About creepyitis.
Creepyitis, where you age like 90 years in 3 months or something like that.
There's actually a name for
there
that.
Is. And it's not creepyitis. No.
Wait, it is now.
Is it progeria?
It could be that. Or creepyitis.
I like creepyitis better.
Yeah, somebody else had talked about him on our show not long ago.
Yeah, because it was the screening. Yeah,
that's right.
Well, he's a
his name again?
huge Charles Beaumont. I mean, he is someone to really. It's hard. His handful of truly precious prose works go in and out of print, but your listeners should seek them out. I mean, one of the great horror short story writers and fantastic genre short story writers of kind of the mid 20th century, and part of that very magical group, along with Ray Bradbury and Richard Matheson, who kind of formed this triumvirate of genre greatness in L.A. in the 50s and the 60s. He was particularly close with Roger, and if people know him now, it's because he wrote easily probably a dozen of the best Twilight Zones.
Oh, right.
I often think if you just list your favorite Twilight Zones, I guarantee you at least one of them, if not an inordinate large number of them, will be Beaumont's, as well as having the glory of having written the one non-genre movie that became not only one of, William Shatner's one great and probably the only great role in Esperanto. You know about this movie?
The one where he had to speak.
Oh wait, I actually.
Is that, yeah,
I'm combining
like
in. Wait, no, I'm combining two.
language?
It is. There's
Kingdom of
The
Spiders.
Intruder. No, exactly.
Intruder.
No,
Oh, he wrote
and
The
it was
Intruder?
But he also wrote The Intruders, which was based on a serious mainstream. It was Roger's attempt to do a.
Oh yeah, The Intruder.
Yeah, I got
racial-
confused, but I was suddenly
Yeah.
a piece of my brain suddenly went to the Esperanto movie, which I've been thinking about lately. But it's not the Esperanto one.
William
He wrote
Shatner
the
wasn't some pretty
Intruder.
strange
He did.
stuff
He was. He was the star of the world's
Yeah.
only Esperanto movie, but it wasn't The Intruders, which Charles wrote. Anyway, he's just a great writer.
Right.
So it was a shock to me, when I. It literally came out of the blue, like one of his weird short stories, where I came home one day to the seedy apartment in Hollywood that I lived in then, in a what would be nice to call Chandler-esque, but it was really more Jim Thompson-esque or something, way sleazier than Chandler. And there was an envelope that had Concord Studios on it, and when I opened it up, it had this, what was a Xerox, but clearly of a onion skin. You could see the texture of the paper, and you could see it reproduced there, and you could see that it had been written on a typewriter. You already knew this was not a recent script, and it was this thing, Paranoia, that Beaumont had written for Roger to direct in, I think, 1962. And then literally left a first draft, like a 163-page first draft, died, and it sat in Roger's drawers. Well, this was probably in 1989, late 89.
Oh, and to interrupt,
Yes, please.
Mr. Beaumont passed away from Pick's disease, which is a form of early onset Alzheimer's, and he died in his late 30s.
Wow.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound as dramatic as what I said, but I guarantee there was also...
Creepyitis.
I have a feeling there'll be a film called that by the end of the show. That's funny.
So he had been. So did you ever get an idea of why Roger decided after, I don't know, whatever it was, 20 some odd years to pull this script out?
I think it had come back to his mind a number of times. I think he had been saving it for something he was going to do, but he had stopped directing. Somebody will see I did about an hour-long documentary on him, kind of a dialogue between him and I, sometime in the early 90s for Italian TV that dealt with some of this. Like, why did he stop directing? I mean, he did briefly come back and do Frankenstein Unbound while we were actually shooting Brain Dead, which we can tell that story later, because Rodman was shooting second unit for him on our sets at the time.
Right.
Yeah.
Frankenstein Unbound took him years though, right?
Yeah,
Because
I
Roger
think so.
told me, like, he was thinking Frankenstein about for like
Forever.
3 years, and I was
Yeah.
running his studio.
Which was ironic because whenever you would complain about like having a 15-day schedule, he'd say, "I shot bucket of blood in a day and a half and had enough time left over to shoot, Little Shop of Horrors." And meanwhile, yes, he did take a little bit longer. But so I think he'd originally intended to do it himself, and for all kinds of other reasons, had just ceased really directing. And then actually, it was his wife who's credited officially as the producer. Roger's the executive producer. The actual producer of Brain Dead was Julie Corman, who did a couple other really interesting films in and around that Corman system. And I think she had said, "Come on, let's just finally make this." And he was like, "No, they won't be the right person." Whatever. For whatever reason, that was they really liked that. That and some plays I had done at the time. So they gave me the chance and the honor to take this truly demented and just out of control 160-page script and try to turn it into something that could be done Roger style in 15 days.
And I mean, it's such an elevated cast for Roger, a Corman film, featuring my favorite actor of all time on my short list of people I most want to meet / cast in a movie. Bud Cort is maybe number one. Like, in the world. Bud Cort's like a dream to me.
And it was a revelation. He was one of the things that really popped out for me. I had not seen it in 20-odd years when those guys showed it at Cinefamily. And his performance actually really kind of ripens well in it. It's so offbeat. So
what was he like as a person? And then did you cast him, or was he? Because I hadn't seen him in anything for a long time.
And you say it was an elevated cast. I mean, it was and it wasn't. We certainly thought it was. Roger was really unhappy initially with the casting because it didn't, have Shannon Tweed in it, or it didn't have,
well, three guys are their leads, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, and not guys. I mean, it's Bill Pullman and Bill Paxton, who today we know, but who were not known for lead parts by any means at the time. The only thing that really reconciled Roger to it was getting George Kennedy in there. He was like, "Okay, you got it now." And George Kennedy actually is great. He's only in like 2 scenes, but he's great. A really wonderful casting director at the time, Barbara Cohen, who died not of creepyitis, but did die far too young, helped me cast that, and I knew her through the theater, through the Actors Gang, which I was sort of the writer in residence for. And it was her idea. Some of those, she came with some of these. And when she said Bud Cort, being someone who was totally formed by seeing Harold and Maude as a very young kid, and Brewster McCloud and movies like that. I knew Paxton, but Pullman was her idea, which was great. And that was an incredible pairing. But Cort was great. He would just tell you these endless stories about the long stretch of time when he lived with Groucho. Those are the ones that are really engraved in my mind. And the two of them dressed in like 1930s style pajamas, like the kind they would be wearing in Monkey Business or something, like one of those night shirts, watching Marx Brothers movies on TV and eating popcorn. And he was a wonderful guy.
Was he pursuing acting in that period? He popped up every 10 years.
I think it was kind of like that. I think when
somebody
he wanted to.
him.
Yeah. He always seemed to do something. I thought I saw his name recently that he was doing.
He was in Life Aquatic.
Yeah, he was in Life Aquatic.
Is that what it was?
Life Aquatic, he's the accountant who comes in. He's small role. But
right.
Yeah, he was in Number 23. And then he did a role. Yeah, he did a role on Ugly Betty. He was in Criminal Minds. He's done a couple of TV appearances.
Such an honor.
All right, coming soon to Salem.
And he did some
Are you out there, Buck?
If you do that, you will be worshipped.
I love him. Yeah, he was great. He was one of my heroes, and that was like a gift.
You're the one guy that put Bill Pullman and Bill Paxton in a movie together.
Yeah, I was going to say, have they done another film together?
No, and I don't think anybody had ever thought to confuse their names before that. So I think that's probably all down to...
And not just that, there's another point of confusion. The kind of tagline, the line where Pullman's about to fall, he also utters basically word for word in Wes Craven's Serpent in the Rainbow, where it says, "Don't bury, I'm not dead," and then yours it's like, "I'm not dead yet," or something like that.
And then I think he did it all again for...
said by Pullman.
Right, exactly. These were Pullman, double Pullman. Yeah.
And then in what's the David Lynch movie where it's like
Lost Highway?
Yeah, which is like the art movie. Again, much better version of mine. Where I think he says several of the same lines in that one too.
He's been in a lot of, people think of him, Independence Day is this like mainstream hero. I think you've watched the movies he's in some oddball, really fun stuff.
He's also a brilliant actor, one I really have wanted to get onto Salem and work the schedules out to do that, because he's just one of my favorite people and one of my favorite actors. But he comes out of, like a lot of my favorite actors, he comes out of the theater, and this is a guy who's doing like, he created a number of the key Sam Shepard parts, and I always had a very avant-garde sensibility and was like a theater teacher. And you think of him, he's the president in Independence Day. He can do that standing on his head. In fact, he probably has done that standing on his head. But he's great.
That's cool.
How did because I remember seeing Brain Dead the box. I'll never forget that image on video. But I mean, what was the release like? What kind of, how did that film do for yourself, for Corman? And if you could talk a little bit about the advertising, because you told a great advertising story. Because Rodman was doing advertising.
He was. It was actually one of Rodman's best things. Thank you, Rodman.
Taglines, right?
Well, and of course, Corman was always about the taglines, though often the struggle was that the tagline would have nothing to do with the movie. I'm like, there's the famous, I remember which one it was, and I know it was a Jim Wynorski who also directed.
Yeah. The Screamers.
The Screamers, exactly.
You will see a man turned inside out.
We had that story on
there. You go.
Exactly.
So that Jim told you that. So that's the class one. So actually, Rodman came up with a great one for Brain Dead, which is many things. I'm not sure terrifying is one of them. I mean, it's a lot of mind-bending, hallucinogenic, mind fucking whatever.
Yeah.
He put along what was a very mediocre photo on the poster of, in fact, one of the producers on it, or associate producer on it, Mike Elliott, just with a giant, one of those mirror things that doctors used to wear in Dr. Kildare shows. I've never actually seen one in real life. And over the top, it simply said, "The most terrifying film of the decade." This was released in February of 1990, which basically meant it was the most terrifying movie of the last 2 months.
And probably even then there had been one other.
Second most terrifying movie of the decade.
Funny.
But
yeah, so how did it do? Like, did
well, for Roger was already transitioning. Transitioning the word. He was pretty much doing straight to video releases, and then was the business model for Concord at that point. This got what was for him, a pretty not only a pretty substantial theatrical. God knows what that would be. I mean, you have to remember that even big movies did not have the release now that they do. Nobody was going out on X gazillion theaters. Right. Screens nationwide, let alone worldwide at the same time. Movies were still circulating, starting in the big cities and the Paramount like that. His movies were still pretty much being distributed in the back of a car, I think. but he'd still made what was for him a lot, probably 100 prints or something like that. So he played, I'm to this day meet people who actually saw it, who can verifiably prove that they saw it on the big screen. And I had a lot of friends in New York at the time who were very excited to go actually see it in Times Square, when that was a sleazy place to see sleazy movies. And here it did played in all the really grindy kind of first run, but not great movie first run ones. And he very unusually for him, he sent it out to a bunch of festivals, because he kind of got that it was kind of an art movie, genre movie,
It's very different from what we expect from him. Like, you know what I mean? This kind of stuff he produced, because I guess, like you said, it's kind of artsy. There's some really cool, surrealistic, crazy shit.
It is, which is also kind of terribly pretentious and hard to take now. It'd be like, it should just be more of a horror movie. But it was much more me definitely channeling a little Buñuel and Philip K. Dick and all this other kind of stuff that I was really into while being excited to make a B movie. But also one of the things that I always thought was great about Corman, and he was open about that's okay, was as long as you hit his parameters, both physically in terms of the length and that kind of thing, but also the exploitable elements in it. It had the requisite sex scene that had to be in there, the one sex scene in at minute 17 or whatever, and as long as it had blood and guts and something that could be in the package, the amount of freedom he would give you content-wise was actually huge. So he got a bit nervous about it because of the structure. At the end, I remember right when we were finished, he was a little like, I don't know, I don't get it. But fortunately, he brought in a lot of the directors and others that he trusted and had worked with, some of whom were already kind of the new graduates of his school who had already moved on to other stuff, like Carl Franklin and Kat Rubin and people like Kat Shea and people like that. And they were like, no, this is good, Roger. It's good. Let it alone.
Did he give a lot of notes, like in the post?
No, he would never. I mean, the only one of my movies that he did that on at all was actually Body Chemistry 2. And we can talk about only this, because it was, and the only note was, we need more sex scenes. And we actually had the only big fight I ever had with him, probably over the fact that I just didn't want to do it anymore. I didn't want to still be doing it. I hadn't wanted to make that movie in the first place. In fact, he had designed the original Body Chemistry for me to do on the same sets from Brain Dead, and from an idea I had been playing with of an erotic thriller about a clinic where they, bring out people, all kinds of crazy stuff. But I then thought, because in fact Brain Dead had gotten a certain little cachet that you could still get from a B movie then, that maybe you can get again now. Though I think there's been about a 30-year period where you couldn't be touched for having made a B movie. But it kind of got enough of that I had gone off with John Landis to develop a movie and done other stuff. And I'm like, I'm not going to do this. And when Roger finally called after a year of me doing nothing, saying, "Are you ready to come fulfill your contract?" Because he had given me like a 3-picture deal out of school, of which Braindead was one of the first. And
interesting that you still had 3-picture deals. Yeah, you had
exactly. I had a 3-picture deal, kid.
Antiquated.
Back in the old days, yeah. Well, or also known as indentured servitude. You know, if it's Roger. But I said, "Sure, okay, I'm ready to work. I just want to make another film. I want to do something." I said, "What have you got?" He goes, "It's Body Chemistry 2," which led me to my first rule for young filmmakers, which is beware what you turn down, or you will be doomed to direct the sequel.
That's good. That's good advice.
Good advice. Be careful. Just go for it. That one didn't have, for ostensibly an erotic thriller, it wasn't erotic enough in his mind, though it had some really good scenes, and everybody thought it was great, and it was, except he wanted like 4 more sex scenes.
Shower scene?
Did not have a shower scene. Did not have a bondage scene. All those. But see, by the end, it did have all those. And in the end, that went from being probably my lowest moment with him when he was most angry to one of the moments to this day he refers to as one of my glory moments there, which was I had determined that I was not going to shoot. I was not going to bring the cast back. I was not going to do more sex scenes. I was not going to humiliate them by bringing doubles in and shooting sex scenes and intercutting it as if it was them. And instead, since it was about a guy with Gregory Harrison played a guy with some bad sexual thoughts being treated by a radio psychiatrist, always a bad idea. If you got trouble as kids, go to a real psychiatrist. Don't use the radio shrink.
Twitter psychiatrist.
Yeah, don't go to Twitter shrink.
Do great.
Yeah. And she was leading him into weirder and weirder sexual territory. So instead, I thought, I said to Roger, I could do like inside his head what he's thinking during these other scenes that you think aren't sexy enough. And they could be anything because we're talking about these crazy fantasies. It's like, yeah, but you're going to have to shoot those. I'm like, no, I'm not. Because we always had access to the library there, which was not only every film he had done, but every shot he had ever done. And in particular, there was a whole section that was kind of like at the end of Indiana Jones, the first Indiana Jones movie where you see all the crates, where everything's made. The equivalent of that at the old Corman studios, the late lamented Venice studios, was a place where things that had been cut out by the MPAA from his movies were kept. They were still in there.
Wow. So that's such a Corman story.
My
right
gosh,
this
it's like a gold mine.
You're not going to lose that. Exactly. Can you imagine?
Scenes.
All gone. God knows all that stuff probably just tossed. But it was a gold mine. So I really went through there and just found like the 5 weirdest sex scenes that had been removed from other Corman movies over the previous decade.
Right.
And cut them in.
And now in 1990, not as
No,
risque.
it wasn't that. The interesting thing was, and Roger's like, this is risky. They're going to reject it. They've already rejected these 5 scenes. Passed through the MPA without a thing. They commented that it was a bit intense, but it was in the context of you were not supposed to associate sex and violence in any positive way, but it was in a negative way. It was being said that he was sick, and it was in the context of this character's like psychiatric treatment and whatever it was, and either that or they just fell asleep during the screening, but they passed him. So to him, this was a huge win. He got 5 new sex scenes that not only had he not had to pay for, he got to screw the MPAA, and he got to use scenes that he had paid for in the past and never got to use. So that was like triple win.
Pure. That's
pure Corman win.
That brings me to my next question. Is it true, or a variation of this? So you also directed Carnosaur for him. Is it true? I've heard that this is one of his most financially successful films of all time.
Roger used to claim that, whether it's to the dollar true, I wouldn't be surprised if it was. I mean, I would say really Little Shop of Horrors is in the sense that it's all the things it spawned.
Right.
It's because he always owned everything. I'm sure Roger's made many, many fortunes over not only the remake, but the Broadway show and all that. But of the films themselves, he used to say that, in fact, I wish I could do a better imitation of his really wonderful baritone, because I do remember seeing him about 5 years after I was feeling fairly bitter about Carnosaur, not thrilled with it, but that's another story we can return to. Him saying, "Adam, no, you have to understand, you made the most financially successful film of the latter part of my career and the most artistically satisfying." It's true they weren't the same film, but they made both of them. Because he did, in the end, love Braindead and the fact that it had gotten acclaim and been at festivals and had a kind of cult status in that way. And he even more so liked Carnosaur. But, okay, here's the true genius of Roger for something like Carnosaur. You have to understand, he had planned that years in advance. He later admitted that basically as soon as Crichton's novel, and he knew Crichton fairly well, as soon as the Jurassic Park novel came out, Roger went out and bought a novel, the rights to a novel called Carnosaur, by a pseudonymous writer who wrote actually John Brosnan, who's written some good books on horror movies and science fiction movies and written some okay science fiction himself, but who also wrote really cheesy stuff under the name Harry Adam Knight, spelled with a K. So it was Hack. It was his little nod to that. And Roger bought the rights without ever any intention of using probably any aspect of Brosnan's book other than that it would justify when the inevitable film was made, because he knew it would happen. He had seen it happen with Jaws. And he always would talk about that, about how Jaws changed everything for me because suddenly they realized they could make my kind of movie on their kind of budget, and I'm screwed. So I think this was kind of his revenge. It was like his revenge on Spielberg. So he had always planned that, and he literally had that in his hip pocket and then the minute they announced the movie, he started production. And it was timed so that we would get to the theaters first, and then and get it for him probably his largest of the last theatrical releases he had. I mean, it had a big, hundreds, if not maybe even 1,000 screens, which for him was crazy. So that then in the era that some of your listeners can barely remember of video stores and blockbusters especially, that then when Jurassic Park was gobbling up the box office, if you walked into a Blockbuster, you would see a wall of Carnosaur videos going, like Jurassic Park, try Carnosaur.
Yeah, perfect.
And he had the ultimate chutzpah because then when asked about that, I remember because the movie got a lot of publicity. It was like he had an interview with Connie Chung about it, which I thought was hilarious. It was like one of the high points. Roger Corman and Connie Chung. And I remember he's on TV going, well, Connie, I know. When he said, she asked him some question about how, do you feel like, people will accuse you of stealing from Steven Spielberg? And he's like, no. And in fact, I know Michael Crichton, he's a very honorable man, and I'm sure he didn't mean to steal so much from John from the novel Carnosaur.
Oh, that's funny.
Since it had been written first and had resurrected dinosaurs.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
He really was a business genius.
He was.
That's the thing.
Well, he was like
It's
a
all
Jekyll and Hyde too, because he was a creative. I don't mean that in the sense that there was that he was bad or in any sense, but only in the sense that there was in him a great artist too, and there was this great huckstering businessman, and the two were often at odds. And I think his own greatest artistic movies were when somebody else was being the asshole, like Arkoff or James Nicholson, people he was close to, but who were producing and releasing all the great Corman movies that we think of as the great ones, that were originally made. If you're my generation, you think of like the Edgar Allan Poe movies and stuff. Then in effect, once he went out on his own and created New Worlds and then New Horizons, which made tons of some great stuff and brought in a whole next generation of directors, of Joe Dante and this whole Jim Cameron and the whole realm. And then in Concord, people of my generation, he had to also become the bad guy, and then that kind of was always at war, I think, with the artist in him.
And that documentary, the one on him, also kind of does pinpoint the intruder, where they take this big gamble to make this real movie that could have been an Oscar type of the time. It pushes the limits,
It does.
It feels very relevant now, actually. I feel like if someone released it now with
in fact, a lot of his problem then was that it was a pretty hard-hitting movie about race relations in America and accusations of rape and about what they used to call miscegenation, when it was illegal for people of different races to have sex, in effect. And the problem, though, was that he was very dependent on the South as for his distribution, especially drive-ins in the South. I mean, this is the guy who would put one of his movies in a drive-in along with Bergman's Persona.
Which he probably brought to the country.
Yeah, totally.
That's the other thing a lot of people don't know about him. He brought all the art films, basically. He got nominated for an Oscar for bringing one of them. For Fellini film or something.
I think it was everything from Amarcord to Cries and Whispers.
If it wasn't for that, I can't even imagine how many of the art house and drama filmmakers in America were.
That's a whole other, thing.
That's a different podcast.
It's a different podcast on the history of art.
It's still fascinating.
Well, but it's a reminder that and I believe it's still true, but it always was true, that things like whatever we call the art film and something like the horror film, maybe just because they're both so far away on the circle from the mainstream movie, kind of touch. But that was equally true not only aesthetically, in the sense that some of us could always really love really out there art movies and really out there genre movies, but that there was actually a connection between the distributors, the producers, the filmmakers. I mean, a guy like Roman Polanski doing his early movies, for the same British company that was churning out like Witchfinder General and Blood on Satan's Claw. Those were the places that could afford to give more out there kind of, as long as they had a little nudity and a little this and a little that, But anyway, he couldn't do The Intruders. Basically, all his theater owners in the South said, Roger, we can't show this movie.
Yeah, and didn't make money.
No.
But yeah, I mean, you look at some of the other directors, Jonathan Demme, Monty Hellman, these guys who
John
really
Sayles.
are. Yeah, John Sayles coming from purely art house, that without Roger, they would have had their start.
Scorsese himself, too. I mean, in fact,
Boxcar
Julie's, Boxcar Bertha, which is also a Julie Corman film, in addition to being a Martin Scorsese movie, is a great example of that, too. But I think the world changed. It changed, ironically, right around the moment of movies like Brain Dead and The Unborn, Rodman's movie, where suddenly, I mean, if you go back and look at the timeline there, that's right when like the first Sundance festivals are. It's when there suddenly is a bit of a birth of a real American independent cinema and the collapse of an old studio system and of an idea in which you naturally turn to the B movies or exploitation movies as a place where new talent learned. And I think in that era, and then exploding in the 90s, instead, it's already started in the late 80s, they were looking to commercials, music videos during the brief moment when those were really huge, and above all then this new realm of really independent cinema. So you get the first Soderbergh movies and the first Kevin Smith movies and what would become a whole different route into being able to make films. That was even 5 years before that, just not conceivable that you could just go out and make your own movie and it would be a realist social drama or a psychological drama like Sex, Lies, and Videotape. If you wanted to go out and somehow make a movie, you had to make Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You had to make it's a lot of what's in American Nightmare. Those I don't think take Wes Craven for example. That's a guy who wanted to be Bergman.
Right.
But how is he going to make that? He's like, oh, well, I could remake Virgin Spring, with hippies raping somebody instead.
Yeah, it's an exact remake, really.
Right, it is. And he admits that he did that at the time. And the point being, that was the only route. Cronenberg was the same way. Really was an art filmmaker who got shoehorned into genres because that was the doorway.
Yeah.
And that, for better or worse, for me worse, for others better, that doorway, in effect, actually, if anything, almost shut right then at the threshold of the 90s. And in fact, having made that kind of movie marked you, I think, in questionable ways, rather than being seen as the natural road into doing anything else.
Mm-hmm. Oh. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about The American Nightmare because it's a doc that I remember reading a lot about it when it initially came out, and it took me a while to find it and track it down. I don't even know if it's available.
It is. I think it is still on video. I mean, I don't know if it's what the Netflix or
it was at one point streaming, but I don't think it is right now.
It's certainly still on DVD.
Here's how I found it. I have an all-region DVD player.
Yeah.
So for no rhyme or reason, I have the Toolbox Murders remake right here.
Oh my God!
The Toby Hooper one. Disc 2 is The American Nightmare. I don't know why.
And they did not pay a
which
dime
you are not
for
making
that.
royalties. Tobe Hooper is making royalties off your.
Oh my God!
Anchor Bay UK
That's hilarious.
And it's funny because at Amoeba, the music store here in LA, they have a lot of used stuff, and because nobody has multi-regional players, all their import DVDs are like $1. So I saw that in the dollar bin, and I'm like, oh, it's got Toolbox Murders, the remake, and it's got a second disc with The American Nightmare on it. I was like, I got to get
Winner,
it.
yeah. I hadn't realized that Tobe Hooper had directed the remakes of Toolbox Murders. That's obviously the connection, because there's a large section in the middle, obviously, of American Nightmare on the original Texas Chainsaw. And Tobe, who's amazing in that, actually. It's my favorite section of that movie. But it's not been always that easy to. At some point, several people had just posted it on their own on YouTube, and I was thrilled just to see it on there in pieces. But I think if you look on Amazon, it is on there, though. It gets often confused with some slasher movie also called The American Nightmare. So a couple people have reviewed it on Amazon.
It's a Debbie Rochon film. I've seen that one. It's about Debbie Rochon as a DJ, if I remember
I haven't seen it. I just know that it's resulted in the only non-5-star reviews on my Amazon page. Thank you.
Blame it on Debbie Rochon.
I gotta double check that, but yeah.
But so I mean, I rewatched it today before we did this show, and the thing that fascinates about the thing that I'm fascinated about it is it's the first horror doc of this sort that really drew a parallel between real life violence and what was happening around the time that these filmmakers were making these films. And their movies, because everything before that was always, I get to see Hitchcock kind of be goofy on the set of Psycho, and but really one of the most disturbing things is the idea of Tom Savini being in Vietnam, talking about it and showing you photos of bodies.
Yeah, he had people had alluded in the past to the fact that he had this background in Vietnam, and I was anxious to talk to him about that because I had this little theory is the wrong word. I wouldn't say it's big enough to justify being a theory, but I was always fascinated by Savini. He's a brilliant guy and was also a sweetheart and super talented. But everybody talks about what changed violence in cinema. And people talk about Peckinpah. They talk about the finale of Bonnie and Clyde and things I remember seeing as a little kid. But when I think back through that period, I think who changed violence in cinema was Tom Savini. That suddenly, when people got shot, they didn't, as he says in the movie, they didn't grab their chest and fall off a horse. Even in those Peckinpah movies, yeah, there's slow motion, but they're pretty much just dancing around. And suddenly, when Tom came there, he brought an anatomically correct reality to death on screen, literally for the first time. And I was fascinated to know where had that come from and, how that had gotten integrated into these kind of basically exploitation filmmaking. And I had read that, of course, he had been in Vietnam. And since, yes, the theme of the movie was not to be too heavy-handed, but in part it was, it doesn't try to tell anything like the whole story of the horror film in America, which would have taken obviously many, many hours, and didn't want to do the classic clips thing. Here's, Terror in the Isles or whatever. I was really interested in, for very personal reasons, in the years 1968 to 1978, which are the years I had gone from being 6 to 16, had really turned like a maniac to horror as a fan, and was living on the south side of Chicago, had arrived on the south side of Chicago just in time for the Democratic Convention and the riots, and found the world to be a very scary effing place.
Yeah.
And was interested in the fact that though mostly what I was watching as horror movies at that time were movies from the 1930s and 40s, Dracula and Frankenstein, I was reading about or hearing about these movies that were coming out then, like Night of the Living Dead. Probably the only one of the movies in that movie, discussed in the movie, that I actually got to see anywhere close to when it was made was Night of the Living Dead, which my father foolishly took me to see on some odd double bill. The others were just movies you could hear about. They might as well have been porn movies in terms of, in an era when you couldn't just turn on the internet and see porn movies. It was just unimaginable if you were a young, or if you were reading not Fangoria, but Famous Monsters of Filmland, to think that you were going to come upon even Night of the Living Dead, let alone Texas Chainsaw.
Well, even Fango didn't come out till 1978. So
that's right.
We would have kind of missed that whole thing.
Well, and it's not that miss it, is I think it was the direct product. That by the end of 78, that was my whole point. That by the end of that period, suddenly you got Halloween, and you got kind of the Americanization of what I think really was the Italian giallo, and a different kind of horror and sex combo. And yes, you got Fangoria. I mean, if I could have done something on the media around horror, it would have been to say, yeah, we're all starting with the transition precisely from Famous Monsters to Fangoria. And it's in the title. It became about gore and stuff like that. And I really wondered where had that come from. And we wanted to start from Night of the Living Dead, because that was the reference point for everybody. I mean, it really was just a bolt out of the blue that changed the whole nature of the genre. So in some part, it also came from just tracing the influence of that movie. Because almost everybody in there, until you get to Carpenter, says, well, I just needed to make a movie. And the only example I knew of somebody who had just made a movie and somehow gotten it out there was George Romero, who was just sitting in Pittsburgh and had no access to Hollywood and no ability to get in his thing out there. But
just threw a print in the truck, right? In the back of the trunk and drove it, yeah.
Exactly. So that sort of inspired all of them. But Savini's thing was, and there's a moment in the documentary, you actually see it on his face. He actually, while we were interviewing him about it, and he was describing it to us vividly, about the fact that he had been drafted and thought that he would perhaps get out of the more dangerous and horrific parts of it by the fact that he was quite a skilled photographer already, and basically got duty as a combat photographer, which in a very peculiar sidelight to the war had to do with photographing damage to particularly enemy bodies and munitions and stuff, which the Army, for its own reasons, was like collating and collecting as part of the whole. You guys were way too young to remember. It's like you'd watch on the news, and part of what you got on the news, the way we now get the Dow Jones Industrial Average, was the day's body count. They were obsessed with these numbers, that how many enemy had died each day. It's the last time we did a war that was so focused on this idea of body count.
That sounds so disturbing. Yeah.
So, hey, surprise, surprise, if that's what you're watching on your evening news. And that was it, the idea that these horror movies kind of popped out of it. And you see it in Night of the Living Dead, the way it intercuts the footage, on the evening news, and the movie itself started to feel like that. But anyway, what Tom said was that he had a moment. He was a kid like me who worshiped the Universal horror movies and subscribed to famous monsters of filmland. And his great dream was to make Frankenstein and these monsters who were kind of lovable. And suddenly there he is in Vietnam, just confronted with unutterable horror, true body horror. And as he would be the first to sort of say, I think, use that camera to just distance him that little bit that he could do it. But what's interesting when you see that he says in there, I started to think, in order to protect my mind from what I was seeing, I started to go back to my makeup that he had been doing before he went to war. He goes, so I started to think, if I was going to do that, how would I do it? How would I make a head look split open like that? Because no one had ever made a head look split open or do anything like that. And he literally kind of made it through the war and I think saved his psyche by basically figuring out in the abstract how he would create the kinds of wounds he was witnessing, which lo and behold is precisely what he did. The moment that was really stirring to me was we were doing that interview in one spot, in his studio, in this kind of meat locker at his studio, when he suddenly kind of stopped and said, I still have those photos. And I was like, okay, cut. Can we go to your house? Can we see him? We then resumed back at his house after he'd gone up to his attic and pulled down. And then, you see the shots in the movie that are actually of the photos he took, in the hours after battles of the bodies. And then, yes, we juxtapose some of that with then the effects he came to do. And you go, well, okay, that's where that came from.
Yeah. No, and it's the biggest revelation in there, the idea that you see him come to this conclusion in the interview where it's like, if what I create doesn't evoke that feeling that I got in real life at Vietnam, then I didn't do it right. Right. And I don't know. I guess, we've always talked and seen about horror in a very analytical way, and we talk about it, but I feel like your doc is the first thing that really, cutting from the assassination of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy straight to Wes Craven talking about the girl getting shot in the lake.
Well, that was one of the really uncanny moments because it was partly in doing the film, we just surrounded ourselves with footage. We were sitting in a little editing room actually in London where we did the film. Getting to go through the BBC's archive of news footage from that period. And there was a moment when we were looking at stuff that I kind of had vague childhood memories of, but hadn't looked at or thought about for years, and went, hang on, stop. And we came upon that image that is a truly iconic image, especially of that time, of the Kent State murders. And it's an image of one of the Kent State demonstrators lying, bleeding on the ground, and the girl is bent over. And you suddenly realized, and I was like, wait a second, what? Cue up Last House on the Left. And you could see that he had literally restaged that moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that was a sudden clue of wait a second. So maybe they were, because not all this was kind of figured out kind of in the process of making it. And then in going to see and spend time and talking to each of these men, that's what we spent most of our time talking about. Not how did you do that effect on this, but what their own emotional reaction was to the chaos in the streets and in society around them. And they got very forthcoming about that. I think partly no one had ever asked them about that before. Yeah. So all of them, Cronenberg, Romero, Craven especially in many ways, he's very articulate in the film, but also Toby, all really opened up and started exploring for themselves the ways in which they were channeling these images that they were seeing every day and the impact those were having on them and the ways in which they were kind of restaging them in these horror movies.
Yeah, you know what got to me too is the idea that because now we live in a day where we see real life violence and things on YouTube clips or news clips and things that get shared on your Facebook feed. So we're so used to it that I get scared that we're going to get too used to it that if we see it in real life we're going to be like whatever, it's whatever. But seeing little bits of footage like John Carpenter's talking about, man, I remember Robert Kennedy getting shot live on TV, and then you show a little bit of that footage. It's still even though it's from a different time, it upsets me way more than any YouTube clip now.
That's an image that it's really incredible. And again, that was a case where it's interesting. It's an image that I had vague childhood memories of because again, like a number of these events, you have to understand they happened live. I mean, I think the closest that happened again later was 9/11. Yeah, particularly say the people who were jumping out of the windows during 9/11. And there was a whole thing going on, I'm sure, at every news station of do we cut, do we not? And those who remember watching some of that live will have seen it. And then in the endless things, they finally said, no, we're not going to show that because it was too horrible. an inordinate number of the truly horrific social violent explosions of the 60s and early 70s happened live. That Kennedy assassination, not the first one, it too in its own way, but it was not being broadcast live. Whereas the Kennedy movement into the ambassador thing, that was all live. And everybody's sitting around watching that. That footage you see in there is interesting because the reel that they sent over to us when we requested this footage from here we are in L.A., right here from the old Ambassador Hotel where it happened, went on much longer than had been shown. So we were watching that and suddenly we're like, oh my God, you could actually, I mean, I don't want to be too gross, but you could suddenly see somebody lift up his head and a piece of his brain fall out. God. And when we finished it, that was the one thing. There were two things in the end that the BBC showed that complete and uncut. IFC, who had really sponsored the film, Jonathan Saring, who ran IFC and who was really the godfather of this movie and who's really protected in every way, but the two things they couldn't let be, and I get it, I didn't find them on it at all, for American TV was the pissing in the pants scene in Last House on the Left, where the psychotic killer makes this girl wet herself. It's truly probably one of the most disturbing images in American film history, I'd say. It's not a film I ever need to see again. Yeah. And the other was, we had to cut out of that scene before that little bit of brain fell. And it's hard. I don't want to bring this whole thing down because we love a horror movie. I love to see gore. But yes, it was about reconnecting that to reality. And what makes that small corpus of films stand out, including from all of the Fangoria era slasher movies that came out of that, was a kind of reality, an emotional reality to the violence in them.
And you could go for one step further. Well, you could go one step further and say we can also thank that period for the resulting fantastical elements of the 80s as a response to get away and forget and sublimate everything they'd experienced. And so without one going all the way down the rabbit hole to realism, we couldn't have turned the other way to one of the most kind of magical periods in film, you know?
And plus with your doc, it was one of the first times for me as a fan that I was able to clearly identify a horror cycle. Because prior to that, I mean, I was just a fan. This is before I started working in the industry, and it all just blended together. I love horror films. Yeah, the 80s had more camp. The 60s, were post stuff, things like that. But it was the first time that I could, really see a clear cycle and understand that the 60s were very kind of buttoned up, and then it got postmodern at the end with Rosemary, and then everything got real. And I could identify it in the aesthetic, too, because everything in the 70s that you were addressing was shot like a documentary. Texas Chainsaw, Last House on the Left, it all looks like news footage.
Even Night of the Living Dead, which is part of its impact is predicated on the fact that was an era when the news was in black and white. Yeah. Even when you had certain programs starting to be on in color, the news was not. And he talks about that. Yeah. George talks about that and how much the aesthetic, exactly what you're saying, that the aesthetic of how it would be. And that's a bit of a revelation, or was a bit of a revelation to me there, too, that there was an aesthetic at work. These were aesthetic choices they were making as artists, as filmmakers.
And just the casting.
I still think that the aesthetic is part of it. Because if you watch Texas Chainsaw Massacre, even for the time period, it's not that extreme. There's not an excessive amount of gore or anything.
No, it's actually quite subtle. I mean, the editing is so precise that you never...
But it's unrelenting. It just keeps going. That's what's unique about it.
And it's the aesthetic, the kind of grittiness, I'm taping this news footage aesthetic that makes it so kind of revolting.
It's interesting. One of the things when I made that movie, in a lot of ways it was intended as kind of my elegy for horror. I sort of thought I was done with horror. I had done with it. I myself didn't want to do more with it in the midst of making that film.
Had you known a lot of those guys beforehand, or was that the way that you met them?
That was my opportunity to meet them, and it was interesting because we had to kind of do it person by person, because a lot of them, I think, especially a guy like Wes Craven, didn't want to talk about those movies anymore. Cronenberg in particular, at first, he was the last movie we got. He kept saying no until... a couple of I had done before that a documentary on Sam Fuller, not a horror director, but one of the great.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It's called the Typewriter, the Rifle, and the Movie Camera. You can see it on Criterion, includes it on some of their.
Is it the one where in close up he's talking directly to camera for a long time?
Yeah,
I've seen it. Okay, that's great.
And Quentin Tarantino's in there, and Scorsese, and other people who were sort of deeply affected. And it contains a lot of the last footage of Sam that he was able to do himself interview-wise. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's one. But so in part, I got some of the guys who are involved in that, like Scorsese, to call who had enjoyed that, being in that movie, to call him and say, no, you should do it. And that didn't do it. And I forget which of the directors we had talked to, who he was reasonably good friends with. It might have been Craven, who called and said, no, have this conversation. You're going to want to have this conversation. Because I think it was a point where someone like Cronenberg had, in fact, made the transition back out of that ghetto into being the chairman of the Cannes Film Festival jury and being seen as the artist that he is and that he was. And the last thing he wanted to do was go back and talk about, I think those movies at the time. And then, and in fact, initially he said, okay, well, we got an hour. We can do it now. And we talked for 7-8 hours. In fact, a British journal called Critical Review published the transcript of that whole dialogue we ended up having, because he got so into it then and said so many, what a brilliant guy, so many fascinating things. But yeah, once they dug into it, so each one of them kind of led us and led me to the next of them, and they got to do it. But I got to touch on what you said about the horror cycles, because I did come away from that with a renewed sense of that myself. Of okay, on the one hand, it's a perennial. We all know there always has been horror. There always will be. You can make your arguments about what are its roots in literature, but there are also clearly periods when it pops up higher and grabs attention, usually for about a 10-year period. It goes just nuts. And it is, I don't know, I'm pretty sure now that if you go back and look, you would be able to tie it to a particular levels of things that are happening that make those movies necessary, that makes people need them.
Well, we always see that type of aesthetic and grittiness during times of war, and therefore it kind of waxes and wanes, which is why we see it come back in the 2000s with Saw and Hostel.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to ask, because what you say about it leading into the period of really more fantasy, which is great, but I think is viewed by some, particularly on the left, as being kind of like the Reaganite, revenge on the, even within cinema, of hey, that Spielberg and Lucas kind of tossed out all of this progress that was being made in terms of the kinds of things you could do. I don't entirely subscribe to it. I subscribe to it a little bit. They did inadvertently, I think, narrow our frame for genre films. But
did you stay stay abreast of what was happening post 9/11? Because I think back to 9/11 now, and I think the funniest thing about it, the strangest thing in a way, is even the word terrorism. I realized before that I was just a word that happened somewhere, like hijacking of a plane, and eventually the plane lands and everything, or something in a Chuck Norris movie. And it wasn't until that then it's been the dominant theme for the last 20 years.
Oh God, yeah.
And so I wonder, and there's definitely been cycles. Obviously, torture porn. There's been a lot of cycles in there, but sometimes they're harder to trace in direct relation to the way we experience media, death, war now. Like what Rob was saying, we can see a beheading, we won't want to, but on YouTube, directly put on YouTube by the terrorists for us to see. And I'm sure there's some really interesting patterns. I just don't know if it's clear because the market is so cluttered.
It will probably take 30 years, but if anybody cares to do it, then another 20, 30 years from now, someone will go back and I'm sure be able to show directly that, yes, a kind of, it's not a coincidence that not just that degree of what we now call torture porn, but a lot of which was precisely the return to these techniques of the late 60s and early 70s, these in terms of the depiction of torture and pain on screen, but also that the image, it can't be a coincidence that the zombie came back at precisely that moment too, in the same, and that somehow those were linked too. I got no doubts. I mean, it will take someone.
I smell a sequel documentary on the way. It could be hooked.
And I will say, I've talked at a panel last year on this, where someone was asking what the current cycle is and how does it relate to what's going on. And this is my theory. It might be a little far-fetched. Mine is intrusion of the public. I think is the current theme that we are seeing in a lot of horror films. If you think like The Purge, it's all about, okay, we're good, but the public's all fucked up. Oh no, the public's inside now.
Yeah.
And that is
the home invasion.
The home invasions, things like that.
Well, even the supernatural films could be called home invasions. You're safe, you've got a nice house, but a ghost is coming to mess up your criminal activity. It's all
about your normal life being disrupted by either something public, which is also where I think that Unfriended is coming in. These ideas of everything that you're doing is being exposed.
Social responsibility on the net.
Yeah, there's a part of me that worries about. I actually think that's totally accurate. Part of what freaks me out a bit about The Walking Dead and the cycle of zombie things that we had is because of their roots in what were probably those large console video games where you could shoot zombies. And the first time I saw zombies coming back post Lucio Fulci was in House of the Dead. Exactly.
Fuck yes.
Right?
I love that game. Oh my God, that game took so much of my money.
I'm convinced that's the key missing ingredient. And here's the thing, though. it's very clear when you watch the original Night of the Living Dead, and even when you watch Dawn of the Dead, and even Day of the Dead, if you get all the way through them, that Romero is positioning you in such a way that you're absolutely terrified of the zombies, but especially in the first one, you're equally terrified of the people with the guns. And there's a lot of emotional ambiguity about the killing of zombies in it. But by the time you get to House of the Dead, you're shooting the zombies.
Right.
And
The zombies pure other.
No, I've only played I think I played House of the Dead maybe 3 through 5. But in them, you're not military. You're like in the one that I played the most, which I think was House of the Dead 5. You were a character named G. Because it was very Japanese. And you were a character named G, and the monster would come down and speak to you and be like, "Are you trying to save G?" Wait, maybe you were trying to save G. Anyway, there was a character named G. But you were like a businessman because you were in a suit.
Right.
And so
but you had a gun and you were shooting it. So it's partly you're training people.
I would stand up for Walking Dead on this. If you go back,
I'm not knocking it. It's
no. I mean on the idea.
Yes.
I would go back to if you actually watch. I think it might be evolving to that, and that could be the storyline that human. But if you really go back to the pilot, it's fascinating because I can't remember the name of the main African American character, but the whole story is about his inability to shoot his zombie wife, who is slowly coming to get him, and he's just unable to
do it.
And it takes
still a thing? That was the first
That's
episode.
the first episode.
Yeah.
And
I think
he's coming back. Spoiler, but this is like 5 seasons. And what I have liked about this series is it does seem like they're taking it seriously, the evolution of how they feel. And even the main character, Rick, has gone from being a sheriff, a good guy, to kind of being really kind of a bad guy and not even necessarily someone you'd want to be with, except if you're on his side. And he's a little unhinged.
No,
and I think it's an interesting portrait.
But let's make a distinction between clearly I mean, this was already true in the comic, the real social and aesthetic intelligence of Robert Kirkman and the great filmmakers that have made Walking Dead versus the mass crapulous explosion of zombie culture in every respect, which is just about, oh my God, mow them down. This and this image of like, oh my God, I'm going to be inundated by the other. I raise it versus these images from '68 is to remember that, okay, this was a moment in '68 when it actually seemed possible that there was going to be a revolution in this country.
Yeah.
That there was revolution in the streets. It was in the music. It was in the festivals. It was at the political conventions. They were not just having talk fests. They were having riots outside the convention centers.
Medium cool.
That's right.
Medium cool.
Exactly right.
Filmed in a riot with Robert Forster walking around like a character acting in a movie while they're filming a real riot.
Oh, but see, that's it. Because to me, the horrific images of 1968 were a glimpse of Night of the Living Dead and being in the back of a taxi, leaving Grant Park with my mother and my brother.
Chicago.
And seeing my father, who was staying, because we had all been at the demonstration, because my parents, we were kind of red diaper babies. They were, big in the anti-war movement, and we were in there. But somebody had come up in Grant Park and said, they would have said the pigs, I would now say the cops, are coming, and they've got their riot gear on. Things are going to get ugly. We're asking the women and the children to go. And one of the last images I had of that was sort of through the back window of one of those old round, kind of taxis we used to have, those old checker cabs or yellow cabs, seeing him just kind of swallowed up in a crowd of the other demonstrators that were then going to be lost in this mayhem, which is just like an image from one of those movies.
And yet, like connecting it to now, I think I could edit the ending of Night of the Living Dead and end with a freeze frame that just said #Black Lives Matter, and it'd be completely relevant to the moment we're in.
Totally.
And you think about that. Think about how much has changed. There's been a black president. I mean, all these things have changed, and yet, you're still at kind of square one.
Well,
or
that they come back, especially in America. That's why it's called the American Nightmare. That we are still repaying and coming back through these things.
The melting pot is a hard pot.
Even one of the films that I'm going to talk about when we talk about
good tag. With Roman to type the melting pot. It burns.
Even one of the films that I'm going to talk about when we get into our witch films in a little bit, Season of the Witch, is still just as it's another Romero film that's kind of preachy on the social parameter, but it's just as kind of poignant today as it ever was.
Yeah,
we can get to witches in Salem. Dare I skip over some of the things you wrote because I need to.
Please do.
Very briefly, thank you for Bones. I'm just going to say that I actually like that movie quite a bit.
Thank you.
Dog one?
Yes.
Holy shit! I had no idea.
Oh yeah, that goes deep. That was an attempt to. And look, there's some things that are okay, and I think Ernest Dickerson did a he did yeoman's work trying to really make that movie work. Speaking of Walking Dead, I really did his best under adverse circumstances to make that movie work. It was, and this is the immortal words of every writer, it was a great script. Now, we had really worked on that for a long time. It was actually conceived of initially by me and Snoop Dogg.
Okay.
We had the same representation at the time.
Hanging.
And Snoop Dogg wanted to be Freddy Krueger. That's the story.
Yeah, well, he wanted to be a horror movie, and I knew his music already. I loved that, but also again, it goes back to this is well before American Nightmare. I don't know. This came out in 90. What year did that come out?
Which one?
Bones.
That was 2001, I think.
Did it come out finally in 2001?
Yeah.
So it was probably
He's a
written.
2000 artist, really.
Yeah,
that's when he was.
Right. So I had probably finished it, but it was actually written in probably 99, whatever it was. It was before that, but it was another attempt to get at something similar, which is my own obsession with growing up on the south side of Chicago and the idea, even as a kid, that loving horror movies, but going, well, I'm never going to go to Transylvania. You know, what if Dracula was in that deserted church at the end of my street?
Yeah.
You know, and of kind of finding a kind of urban Gothic and of dealing with the terror of urban life that I had growing up there. And it's got its moments to get at that, but it's fun, and it was great to do just to do it with Snoop and Pam Grier.
Pam Grier.
I haven't seen it in years, but I remember I enjoyed it immensely when it came out.
I'd have to
Hold on,
rewatch.
I just had to run out. You did Bones.
You wrote Bones.
As in Legend of Jimmy Bones.
The Legend of Jimmy Bones. Exactly.
Did you write the rap?
No, Snoop actually wrote the rap.
Oh man, I love that song.
He loved that, and he loved the whole
Jimmy
idea of
Bones.
it. Yeah. It's worth, I don't know if you can still find them. If you can find them, it's worth getting the original the DVD release of that for a couple reasons. A, it actually had some really cool documentaries added to it that they did. One on the whole idea of urban Gothic and urban horror, and another on something that both Ernest and I shared, which was a great love of Italian horror movies and their influence on it. But all the more so for the commentary track, which we recorded in Snoop's house, and in which you can hear the inhaling of these enormous Snoop-sized blunts, and kind of hear him. Probably you can hear me falling asleep because of the Snoop-sized blunts, but you can hear Snoop going.
That's hilarious.
I'm breaking out that DVD tonight. And then also, you wrote Haunting in Connecticut.
Yeah, both of those films. Actually, I should give due credit to my co-writer on those, Tim Metcalf, who I worked with for years, and we still do a lot of stuff together. Who also wrote California, the David Duchovny.
Oh, the one with the K. I like
That's
that.
right.
Shave that dog and teach it to hunt.
That's right.
I'll never forget
Which,
that
by the
line.
way, is one of the funniest and scariest scripts I ever read, and it's a pretty darn good movie. But
Yeah, it's a fun movie.
the script's better. That's
It's a
right.
fun movie.
It's a good one. Not to mention they, worked on the original Revenge of the Nerds. He's a wonderful writer. We did Haunting in Connecticut together, which was a true story.
Yeah. Well, what's that like, tackling something that's a true story? Like when you're a screenwriter investigating something that really happened, quote unquote.
Well, the key there was, first off, we all know that a true story is not entire. I hate to break. Okay,
Texas
kids,
Chainsaw
if you
Massacre,
believe in
based on
Santa
a true
Claus, put
story.
fingers in your ears right
So there
now.
weren't hundreds of bodies in the walls, just like two.
Exactly. There was actually just like a pinky.
Yeah.
No, actually, in that case, what was very real, and they had done documentaries about it, and I'd read a bunch of interviews. We had read interviews, and then, in fact, I made Tim go do. I made him. He volunteered, but I made him. He did really extensive interviews with the family, those who were willing to talk, the mom especially, and the son who's at the heart of it, and got a lot of the emotional reality of what had happened. And who knows what actually happened to his family, but clearly there was a traumatic experience there that was experienced as a haunting. What there was no clue to was the source. And as we all know, ghost stories are inherently mysteries. They're in part about why.
It's all Rebekah.
Yeah,
It's Rebekah.
exactly.
Yeah.
What did it come from? What is it? What's the crime that was committed? What was the thing that did it? So this was a great combination of being able to tap into especially the emotional reality of this family falling apart under the stress of, on the one hand, a potentially terminally ill son and a haunted house, but had we had a lot of freedom to invent what had happened in this house to cause it to be haunted. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I'd always felt like when you saw those things in haunted house movies, they weren't very convincing. But I was really interested in the early part, that whole period from probably the 1870s up to the 1920s, when this whole period of spiritualism and people doing seances, not your goofy Ouija board seances, but really serious, the smartest people around trying to contact the dead. And was particularly fascinated by how many scientists at the time were obsessed with this. They were not viewing this. I mean, the word spiritualist makes you think, we think of that as a kind of quasi-religious New Age thing. But no, these were guys like William James, the great Harvard psychologist. These were some of the inventors of modern electricity who were convinced that they were 1 inch away from breaching the wall between the visible and the invisible.
We talked about this last week when we were talking about man creating monster. We talked about galvanization.
Exactly.
And, yeah.
And that's fascinating. I mean, listen, we could do a whole other show on the ways in which early science fiction and horror are inseparable.
Right.
And it's scientists who are often pushing those boundaries back, et cetera. So,
and that used to be done in like a square. Like I read that galvanization was something that they would set up in like Times Square, in like a square in London, and they would take a dead body and electrocute it and watch it dance around. So it was the public was actually seeing this.
Yeah, the public was a little more morbid back then.
Back in an era when
public hangings is kind of like
exactly. I was going to say exactly public hangings, public execution,
which works pretty well with Salem. I got to say, when we get there, a lot of public hangings.
In the original story of Haunting in Connecticut, was he actually sleeping in the room with a door that wouldn't open to a room that he had no idea what was in there? Because that would fuck my shit up.
Yes, what was not clear was what was coming at him or why or any of that. What was invented, I will admit, is the guy who had been living there who was doing these weird kind of trying to use the bodies to create a kind of electrical circuit that would open the door between, and was on the one hand inscribing all the bodies in this,
that's right, yeah.
Real. And again, I try to always make those things as real as possible. So like he's inscribing with actual necromantic sigils and various things.
I remember one of them said Suspiria.
Well, yeah, there's
nod or two.
Not an Argento nod. That was because those were phrases meaning breath in Latin or whatever it is. Actually, the real goal I had in that was because I'd always, ever since I was a kid, been obsessed with this idea of ectoplasm. And though I enjoyed Ghostbusters as much as the next guy at the time when it came out, I was like, that's not ectoplasm. I really, because I was fascinated to read these descriptions at the time of people who were seeing this stuff appear. And they're not describing it. It's not day glow. They were describing it as like meat, if smoke were meat, with texture and, I mean, really creepy specificity to what that was. So, like, the one thing I'm most happy with in that movie is when the ectoplasm comes out, you've never seen anything like that. It's creepy, and it looks like what, if you look at old photos that they were taking in the early part of the century, or the descriptions they were doing of these weird extrusions, Now, probably in reality, that's because they were faking and bringing a piece of liver from the butcher shop and slipping it, out of their nostrils and stuff. But there's good ectoplasm in that movie.
Yeah.
It was a well-cast movie. I think that helped elevate the final actual for the director. It was an Australian director, right?
Yeah, Peter Cornwall.
That's right.
Did a very good job of just grounding it, making it very real. And
Virginia Madsen.
Virginia Madsen was really good. And what's his name? Who played the husband? Who was in a lot of the Hal Hartley movies, and who also brought a lot of reality.
Martin Donovan.
Yeah,
big fan.
Brought a lot of reality.
Him.
I don't know why we haven't seen more of the. Again, I'm going to show my early onset style Alzheimer's, but I don't really remember the boy who played the lead in it, but. He was extraordinarily good, and I don't know why he hadn't.
Kyle Gardner or something?
He was in the Nightmare on Elm Street remake.
Because he was very good in that.
Yeah.
He's still good. I saw him in something else. He has a real intensity for a young actor, which is pretty rare, like that kind of serious, intense. But I don't know recently.
He did a lot of TV for a while, too.
Yeah. I feel like he's in something. Yeah.
So I mean, obviously, it seems like you have proved yourself as a genre fan, obviously.
Even though you're trying to get away from it.
Trying and they won't let
you. You're Pacino in Godfather 3.
That's right.
Pull you back in.
But so how did the whole Salem thing happen? I mean, did you have experience in TV? Were you trying to create a TV show, or what? Like, how did it come about?
I was not, and I did not, in a word. I mean, I had written a couple of. At that point, maybe Tim and I had written a pilot together, and I had written one. But no, and if you had ever said to me at probably any point from now back to when I was, 10 or 12 and first thinking I really want to do this, that not only would I do TV, but that I would find my greatest, creative satisfaction and my sense that I could do the most with the genre in TV, I would have thought, you're absolutely nuts. But that's because let's face it, TV was totally shit for most of our lifetimes. And
it's not what you turn to for horror by any means.
No, and never. I mean, there was the Twilight Zone.
We had but there was a lot of crap. You're right.
Yeah. There was always some great TV shows, but that it was not what you would have thought of as the place to go really for real drama, let alone for real horror.
I could have counted like the good horror TV shows that occurred during my generation up to around The Walking Dead, American Horror Story, Salem area. I could have counted them on one hand. Like
and they
X-Files,
were mostly, besides X-Files, but when we were young, they were mostly the kind of shows that were like one-off episodes, like The Hitchhiker, Friday the 13th.
Yeah,
exactly.
they
weren't
anthologies.
an ongoing storyline, which I think was harder to pull
even
off.
like Friday the 13th, which functioned as like a narrative plot, but it was still all standalone.
Yeah, it's just standalone.
Yeah, they were all still harking back to the Twilight Zone model. And
totally.
Outer Limits, which was a glory days for sure. But no, other than maybe key show of my childhood, Dark Shadows.
Or Kolchak.
Kolchak was the other one. But that was actually probably the most direct progenitor for X-Files, no doubt. No, it never seemed, it was just never something I was thinking about. In part because it's just, for those very reasons. I've counted myself to be really fortunate that kind of that door opened to me in the midst of what clearly is a kind of golden age of that, and also kind of a, what I feel like is a kind of shit age for movies in some ways. Not, which isn't to say there aren't great movies made and that there won't be and that it won't in the future. There are, but for all kinds of circumstances, mostly just, I think, financial, the kinds of movies in the period, for example, after Haunting Connecticut, the kind of movies that you could even make as horror movies was very limiting. I mean, I have a lot of admiration for Blumhouse and the movies that they've done out of this, say, found footage format. And I have a huge admiration for the explosion of great foreign horror films in the last 20 years. That's really inspired me. I just think it's brilliant.
Are there any films in particular in the last, decade that you've just kind of gone, oh yeah, that
Well,
brings me
I have to
back
say,
to it.
I really, frankly, had kind of written off the genre. It was just nothing to me that was of interest. I think the first things that reawakened me to that there was something interesting going on would have been early this century when we first started seeing the Japanese and Korean horror films.
Yeah.
And those were a revelation. They really were like a total renovation and a true revolution. They and I think they woke a lot of people up here too.
Right.
Movies like The Ring, the Kiyoshi Kurosawa films too, like Keiro and Cure, the Korean ones like Tale of Two Sisters. Those really were like, this can be the most creative genre.
And then you see Europe finally get in with like Let the Right One In, and then you're like, oh my, it felt so magical to see a culture and a country you hadn't seen in that arena.
Exactly.
The French represents himself with a horror film,
and so, the Frontiers and some
French
of the
extremism,
inside ones. And then, particularly I think then the one that just turned me inside out was Martyrs, I got to say. That one I just thought, and even when I thought, okay, the one thing, it starts, you've obviously seen it, so for a long time you think, oh shit, is this kind of just torture porn? And then it turns into something so metaphysical
bigger than
and so genius, I can't even begin to
And it goes
say.
back to like you've been watching, a lot of us fall in love with horror when we're young, when we haven't seen as many movies. So if we're lucky enough to see those formative movies, and then you watch a lot of movies, and they're so formulaic, you can write most from the start. And then you watch something like Martyrs, where in a million years you could not come up with where it goes. And not enough movies take us somewhere. And that's why last year I was like in love with Under the Skin or movies like because it took me somewhere I could never have written that ever.
Agreed. And I think
that's somebody else to
that's the greatest pleasure. I mean, it's nice to see the tropes done again.
Right.
It's nice to see the corpses brought up and danced the same way you used to like to see them go. But no, there's nothing to compare to the satisfaction of seeing something that you've not seen before. So that was there, but that's harder and harder to do, especially in an American context, when instead you just really get gigantic films of a certain size, or very small movies that tend to not be genre at all.
Yeah, we've lost our kind of midsection of horror. Everything is under 100,000 or like over 15 million.
Yeah.
And there's really no middle ground anymore. And I mean, the ones that we see there are few and far between.
Agreed. It's just gotten really, that's hard. But there's an equal version of that for Hollywood in general, where kind of the mid-budget movie kind of disappeared. The $30 to $60 million movie also effectively
the Ice Storm
disappeared.
budget. I always tell people it's the Ice Storm movie that you'll never see again.
That's right.
Great movies.
But
like
ask
that,
yourself, what's the budget of a season of cable television? It's about 30 to 60 million, depending on whether you're Salem or I think it actually has, not least which because it's probably pretty impossible to make your money back on a $30 or $40 million movie. A movie costs so much. It's easy to make a movie in a funny way now. It's almost impossible to get anybody to know you've made it unless you spend millions, if not hundreds of millions, to advertise it and to get people's awareness of it. So that kind of film, if you haven't made a film that A, is part of a series or can generate a series and that can justify an ad budget that's many times more or as big as the budget, it just can't function, except for those 1 or 2 movies a year that come out of festivals. And
if a tree falls in the woods, that's what it is now.
Oh, exactly.
No one, it's real a shame.
Yeah, but I do think what that opened up was this other realm where you could make a season of, especially on cable, obviously less so on the networks, but you could make a season of really interesting cable television. You could make 10 to 13 hours of drama for about what used to be a mid-budget movie. And there are now more continuing and ancillary markets and ways for that to continue to earn in ways which those movies can't, because the video market is kind of non-existent and most of those movies don't travel well and don't play foreign. So they kind of are almost unless they win the Academy Award, and even then they don't necessarily make their money back. Whereas
I heard that with Whiplash. I heard Whiplash isn't like going to make anyone anything.
No, because no one will see it in the rest of the world.
Which is insane because it's such a great movie.
It is great, but that's sort of the nature of this thing. So it has opened up this other possibility, which it's funny because I'd always loved and read and been, I mean, as a reader, I loved series fiction. I also loved serialized fiction when I was growing up, whether that was, Dickens and Dumas or, Doc Savage or whatever, or The Shadow. So the idea of being able to actually tell a story in time that way was hugely appealing. But it really kind of just came out of the blue, the opportunity to do it. I had written this pilot that people liked a lot that NBC had bought but had not gotten done, and a particular executive who had left ABC and was now running TV for Prospect Park named Josh Berry had liked that, and we had met and talked about different ideas. And then literally I have to give him the credit because he called me one Halloween of 2012 to say out of the blue, do you think there's a series in a supernatural view of Salem? And I didn't take 2 seconds to say yes. I mean, of course there is. Not least which in one of those great just synchronistic ways. I had literally just received as a gift from my brother, who's a law professor and who always gets goodies. He can order wherever he wants from university presses because he does stuff for them, like tells them that's a good book or don't publish that or that's crap, whatever. And would often let me pick books that I wanted from these. And he had stuff coming to him from Cambridge University Press, and I had looked through their catalog and seen that they had published this. The kind of book was intended only for libraries. It was like a $200 hardback that was a compendium of every scrap of paper and everything we had from the Salem witch panic. And I said, can I have that? And literally, I had that book for maybe 2-3 weeks and just kind of idly looking into things when out of the blue, Josh called. So then I was like, that's funny you say that. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned overseas markets, and I always pay attention to like how films are selling overseas or what film trends are hot overseas, but I never pay attention to television. So how does television sell overseas? Like, do the trends still carry over?
Well, I'm not an expert on that, but I'll go ahead and opine anyway.
You're on a podcast.
Because I'm on a podcast.
You don't have to be.
And that is still key. Actually, the interesting thing in relation to that to Salem is for some reason we have really obsessive fans in Brazil where the film is not, where the show is not broadcast, but where it's intensely illegally downloaded, which I'm all for. If you're in Brazil, especially.
They don't know the history of Salem or the.
But what they have is a very live. First of all, I think part of the beauty of Salem is that it's one of those words that everybody's kind of heard of, even in the rest of the world. If you know anything about American history, like Revolution, Salem Revolution, Civil War. Maybe that's it. But I do think there was some sense of that. But I also, my sense from being in dialogue with some of these folks down there who love it is that they just have a much more active witch culture than we do, and a much more active black magic culture than we do. And it's much more live to them now. Look, it's one of the reasons TV is excellent now. If you look at the periods when I think movies have got really interesting, like the 60s, it's often or the 30s for that matter, it's often for the same reason, which is that, in fact, America, which is often very closed off to the influences of the world, for one reason or another opens up to popular media from elsewhere. So in the 30s, we have the Nazis to thank for that, So all these German filmmakers, all these French filmmakers explode into Hollywood, right? Because they can't function there. And even English filmmakers initially, like Hitchcock, people who are doing things really different than us come in and utterly explode what we were doing. And I think there's a similar thing. I don't think you can separate a lot of the stuff that happened in the 60s from the explosion of European filmmaking.
French New Wave.
That's right, French New Wave.
You could also say the same thing in the 90s when we see the Japanese and French films.
That's right. Yeah. So I do actually credit a lot of the renovation in the American horror film entirely from the Asian and European explosions of those. And similarly, for the first time almost ever, you are seeing, Scandinavian shows, British shows, which we used to only have on PBS, actually being made, or at least being remade.
A lot
of remade straight shows.
Yeah, we are seeing a lot of British shows. Previously, I would only watch British shows like 25 years after the fact. I would discover Fawlty Towers and be like, oh, this is the greatest show ever. I don't know why I've ever seen it. But now we're seeing things like Black Mirror. I got really into The Fades. I think it's called The Fades. Yeah. Last year and binge watched the entire episode.
I was stunned at... I was really stunned. Last year's first year I had been at Comic-Con as a pro, as opposed to being as a fan 20 years earlier when actually it was about comic books. Shockingly.
No. Now it's movie studios. But
when I was shocked that time, I couldn't, and you can't, I thought to myself, wow, is there any other point in my life when I could have walked around an event like this that's a celebration of very successful commercial pop culture and cult culture and see the amount of Sherlock material and Doctor Who material and other stuff that was coming straight, again, out of what's basically still, it's a common language, but a foreign market. But add in the number of our TV shows from Ugly Betty to, what was the show about the shrink on HBO? Or
Treatment,
In Treatment, exactly. God, I really am getting Alzheimer's. The not 24, but the Showtime counterterrorism. Homeland, which are actually adaptations of foreign shows. Those are Israeli shows. Homeland was an Israeli show. In Treatment was an Israeli show.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I think that there was suddenly an openness and vice versa. So it's as much about the fact that we've always been able to force feed American culture around the world, but some of our best moments come from, surprise, surprise, since we are, the American culture we are, when we also open up the ears and the eyes and see what everybody else is doing, go, hey, wait, we can do that. So as much as they've been blown away by the wave of TV from The Sopranos to Breaking Bad, professionals, I think, in television have been suddenly aware of the incredible work in a format that we never did before, which was limited, serialized, grown-up drama.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It just didn't kind of exist as a format, really, in this country. You had 22-episode procedurals or soap operas or whatever you had, but the idea that you could do, who else was making 10-hour grown-up genre and non-genre dramas? Everybody else in the world except us.
I remember seeing Life on Mars.
Yes,
the
BBC perfect example.
Show.
That's right, the BBC one.
And this is long before the
Killing, exactly.
Yeah,
that's right. And that goes way back. For them, a mystery series was Prime Suspect. For example,
Prime
was one of the really
show.
And it's not like professionals here didn't see that. I think they did. And then suddenly, because of HBO at first, and then the explosion in cable, it became possible to do that form. That is a truly great form that just didn't exist in American media before. Limited in scope, not 22 hours, but 10 to 13 hours. Also, significantly, aimed at a grown-up audience. At a movie in an era when movies had to appeal to kind of almost the youngest viewers and largely illiterate viewers worldwide. Suddenly, and when movies studios did not want to hear about something aimed at people really 30 to 50. Suddenly TV is like, no, we'll take them. That is exactly who we want to talk to. And so suddenly protagonists who are in middle age, dramas that come out of life situations that would not be appropriate for a popcorn movie became possible. And yes, we have these also wonderful examples of the fact that especially the Europeans, but equally also the Latin Americans and the Asians have been making drama in that form for decades.
It's funny. I'll tell you why I didn't watch Salem.
Thank you.
You want a good segue? And I went out of my way not to watch it, and I'll tell you why, which is interesting. It might surprise you. You surf channels, and it was when a lot of horror stuff was coming out.
Yeah.
And at one point, I turned the channel and I saw the teaser for it. I think it was before it had started, and it looked to me exactly like The Crucible. I didn't get that there was a supernatural element to it. And so I remember seeing the teaser and go, a period thing. And I just remember going, no, I just couldn't do it. And at some point I must have even flicked the channel and saw even a minute of it. And there was in a court trial. I was like, okay,
and there's a pompous Puritan. It is, goddammit.
And then one of our fans, it was probably Ken Hanley, wrote saying, I think he even said, especially you, Elric, this is the most Lovecraftian show he's ever seen.
Thank you. I was about to mention Lovecraft. I was say, this is not Arthur Miller.
And he also mentioned Fulci. And then I watched the first episode, and it took maybe the whole episode, but then this thing comes running out of this kind of weird devil creature monster, and I remember going, oh, okay. And so I stuck with it, and lo and behold, by the last 3, it kind of went all the way that way. I'm not on the second season. So I'm really glad I did.
I must say, I had a similar thing. There's a reason that I didn't start watching it until recently and started talking about it on the show. And it was, again, Ken Hanley from Fango convinced me to start watching.
He actually wrote some, I have to say, it's not that often you get to, read, you can read good reviews, you can read bad reviews. There's not that often you read someone who just totally gets what you're doing. And Ken's writing out. I don't know him at all, so I'm not blowing smoke up his invisible ass, but he got it.
No, he definitely because Elric and I had talked about how neither of us had seen the show, and some people had tweeted us like, hey, you guys you never talked about Salem, you should check it out. And we're always like, yeah, we'll get there. But Ken was the one who really pushed us at it. But the reason I hadn't seen it was I thought it looked like, I don't want to say a weepy, but like a female drama, something like Practical Magic, where it's more about women having intricate relationships with men, and there's some witchcraft there too.
Right.
Something more like Practical Magic,
and that was
kind of what pushed me
it.
away. And I think that's kind of what it was marketed as at first, was kind of this romantic thing. And there's a little bit of witchcraft. And so that's why I never watched it, is because
before you say anything, I will tell you one of my favorite things about it is the romance.
Thank you.
I find myself really rooting for the romance.
Again, I have not seen the second season yet because it has not reached VOD yet.
But we haven't seen it. And we hear that's when it gets great.
I hear it gets great.
I think it does. We got to both Brandon. I got to do the shout out to Brandon Braga, without who the show would not have been possible. He's a really, even in the era when there was not a lot of good stuff on TV, Brandon was making great TV. I mean, he did some of the most amazing science fiction ever in his best periods of Next Generation and the other Star Trek work he did, and that did incredible work on 2 science fiction shows that I loved that didn't get to continue to very long, but which were the closest thing to real science fiction we often saw in there, which was Threshold and Flash Forward.
Flash Forward.
But he had never done horror and always loved it. And when I, in effect, sold this idea to Fox 21, the studio that behind it, I had not the slightest idea how to make a television show and no experience with it. And they were like saying, we're going to make this show. This is such a good concept. We really think this can do it, but we'd like to ideally pair you with someone who knows what the fuck they're doing. Mm-hmm. And I was very fortunate, and in the end, they were very fortunate that the guy they most wanted to get to pair me with, Brandon, when he read the stuff I'd written on it, and then when we met, was like, oh my God, I definitely want to do this. He was a lifelong Lovecraft fanatic and a horror fanatic who'd never gotten to do that. It took us, I think, the first season to kind of fully get our feed into it and learn how to do quite the language we were trying to do with it, because it's really not like anything else. I mean, the way people talk on it is different, and I think in order to also kind of lay off the risk of having a lunatic like me co-running a show like that and creating a concept that is, once you watch it, as weird as it is, they'd also surrounded me with some exceedingly talented professional TV writers who I think were bringing their exceedingly good instincts from the kind of TV they had done that I don't think matched actually with at all what I saw it as being. And I don't think this was their fault, but I just think it was like this. So there's a sense when you watch the first season that it's going along one way, and then it kind of takes a turn like this and then like this, and it doesn't always capture the language. And there's certain things that I had wanted to do from the get-go, like base all of the craziest shit on it on the real things that for the previous 400 years people had said were possible, and to use the incredible things in history that were the just that you would think we had most made up, like the frog coming out of him and stuff like that. Whereas in the second season, those people were gone, and we got new people to work with us on it, and I was able to tell the story in more continuous fashion. So it's much more, you will see 13 chapters of one story continuing directly that story. And it was just a more congenial environment for that. Also, we had very much gotten a green light from Matt Chernis, the head of WGN, who said, actually at Comic-Con the year, not this year that we just had, but the one before that, after the first season completed, he said, okay, next season, he said, I want you to go full on the horror. I want you to unleash the horror that I know is in you and that you've had to keep contained. He said, I will be happy if, he said, I believe this can be the best horror show on TV. And lo and behold, when, I don't know if it was Ken, but somebody in Fangoria wrote and said, hey, this is actually quietly the best horror show on TV, with all due respect to the huge giants of horror that are on TV, we felt like we had done that. And partly it was by, really channeling our Lovecraft, but also great levels of Italian horror and other things like that we had. So it goes into a very different direction. But I got to jump on something you said about the love side of it and the weepy side of it. Because I plead guilty to that because my wife used to make fun of me because, well, for many reasons. But amongst them,
number one, because you're married.
Exactly. You. But amongst others, that every couple's got their bedside tables with what you're reading, and she would say, "This, your side of the table is like half really trashy, like a horror and that kind of stuff, and then you would be having like your Jane Austen or your Georgette Hay or Regency romances." I have a great taste for the romance genre, and I've always been fascinated by the way in which horror and romance. They came out of one and the same, okay? In the Romantic period, they're inextricably in there. So Dracula. I unabashedly wanted to get back to that Gothic romance part of it while making the horror as hardcore as it could be. Add to that, I really felt like as a male writer, and you can hear from my voice I am male, and I'm very hairy except on the top of my head. The idea of I was actually interested in these female characters and also really felt the lack of complicated, tragic female characters on TV. I mean, there are one or two, but mostly not, especially as we were first writing the show, which was, obviously some time before it actually got filmed and got on the air, where we were seeing characters like Tony Soprano or Walter White or a whole range of male anti-heroes and archetypes on there, but the women were still not like that. I mean, they would be that way a little bit, but the idea that you could actually build the show around them. Now, I get that then when they're selling it, it looks like I totally get what you mean by, is this going to be The Witches of Eastwick or Practical Magic or other versions of that? And I don't think it is at all, obviously, when you watch it.
As soon as I watched it, I was like, this is so not that.
But at the same time, I think it really gets something from, and this is not to, knock the men who are in it, especially, Seth Gable and this incredible male acting, I think, and male characters in it. But unabashedly, it is about the women. And it is about this takes us into this whole idea of the witch. I mean, I was fascinated by that archetype and that image and how rich and wide it is and all the aspects of the female and the female psyche and the female soul that it plays with in the way that we're all used to all of what are basically male monsters or male monstrosities. And we're comfortable with the ways in which that illuminates and illustrates all kinds of parts of us. We all have a Frankenstein monster in us. We all have got a Jekyll and Hyde. We've all got a werewolf. We've all got a Dracula. We've all got a Hannibal, for that matter, in us. But that same wide range of really fascinating and disturbing and dark images and streams on the female side still was kind of taboo, it seemed to me. You just weren't allowed to go there.
And it has a lot of weak males in it. One of my favorite characters in it is the priest. And he reminds me so much of the same priest character from Ken Russell's The Devils.
A big inspiration, no doubt.
Yeah, and it's that same kind of character who's like struggling so hard to rationalize everything that's going on to the point that he's just like, it's witchcraft. No, it's witchcraft. But yet he has that weakness with Azure Parsons as the prostitute.
Wait till you see him, and that's Seth Gable, who's a fantastic actor, playing somewhere in heaven or hell, wherever else they've stuck the real Cotton Mather. He's freaking out about the fact that he's being portrayed in this way. But that's, I love everybody in it, and Janet Montgomery's Mary Sibley is, I think, off the charts. But what Seth's done with Cotton Mather, the priest, the Puritan reverend that you're talking about, who is, by the way, also
frequents prostitutes.
Who frequents prostitutes. And we don't think in real life he necessarily did that, but we brought that in there. But he was a fascinating character in real life, too, and wrote sort of the first American bestsellers and wrote all this just crazy, crazy stuff, but also was a proto-scientist corresponding with Newton and guys like that. wait till you see season 2, what happens with that character there. And boy, by the time you get to the end of season 2, I say nothing but, well, boy, it's really queued up for some a very strange trajectory for him.
When do you know when you're doing a series? Because I'm just using, obviously, Hannibal, the creative freedom in Hannibal, which has just been kind of astounding. But when do you know that you get another season? So you're kind of going off the rails. You're going full horror number 2. Do you know halfway through or before that you're likely to have a third season?
Well, we were lucky in that the show had originally been developed for FX, and for any number of reasons. Mostly, I think because I'm assuming on some level because they really loved it, but that because Ryan Murphy, who's obviously a brilliant horror creator and a brilliant creator, decided to have season 3 of AHS go in a witchy direction. It was just like, we can't have 2 witch shows. So that was just at the moment they were about to film, to put the pilot into production. And instead, this new network that came out of nowhere, WGN, but which was being founded and run by people who had been an earlier regime of FX, came along and said, hey, we'll forget the pilot. We'll do 12 episodes. Well, 13 episodes. We'll do the whole thing. So we had the initially huge plus of getting to go from a pilot script to an order for 13 episodes. That was huge in that usually when you do a pilot, you have no idea even if that pilot's going to get picked up. So, you're not going to build permanent sets. You're not going to, there's all kinds of limitations of what you could do. Because we knew that at minimum we were going to get a full season's worth, we could spend the money to build that whole town that you see there. So that's a full-size Salem, Massachusetts, built in the swamps of Louisiana.
It's so
that's Louisiana.
And
weird.
cold-looking.
Yeah. And it is, all which is true. And we could spend money to have these incredible costumes. And if you're, all that, there's dresses made of human hair. There's such genius in intricate stuff like that, and all that kind of stuff. Even could you afford to make real props? All that stuff. If you're just doing a pilot, you can't. But if you're going to do 13. You can't.
So, like the trench of bodies.
Oh, yeah.
Does that really exist? Is there an actual trench that you're just like, all the actors lay in here?
Yeah. The crag. And wait till you see what happens in season 2 to the crag. Yeah, that we filled that up with bodies. I've never been so happy not to be an extra in my life because they were lying naked in this cold mud, surrounded by snakes and bugs and the worst things.
And I have to applaud you for this horror moment because this was when I was like, I'm totally hooked. One of my favorite moments of the first season was when they're trying to get the dead to talk, and what they do to get the dead to talk is slice his face off and strap it to a tree.
Yeah.
And it's just so gruesome.
Which was also a little kind of brain dead thing because it goes back to that cover, the VHS cover.
Oh my God, that totally makes sense now because it's literally like suspended on twigs. And because
there was a lot of talk about how are we going to do it. I'm like, guys, we did this in 1989. I'm sure we can figure out how to do this with a face now. But in terms of when you know what you're going to do, we were exceedingly lucky then. So we got to do a whole season. And then in part because WGN was still even just developing their second show, Manhattan, which is really a very worthy and interesting show worth seeing, though it has no genre elements, but it's still really, really good. The first couple episodes really had a big impact, and for them it was like 10 times the audience they'd ever had for their other shows, which was like reruns of How I Met Your Mother and Cubs games. So it was not necessarily that high a bar to
jump over. Chicago.
It was originally the Chicago station in the way that, say, TBS was Atlanta. But then they were so it was always a super station, and they were trying to turn it into a full-on cable station with original programming. We were their first original program. So not only did they put that in there, but ultimately there was no house style to equal to. They were like, whatever you do, that's going to define kind of who we are. So in that case, literally during the week after episode 2 broadcast and got a good response and good numbers, they were like, okay, you're doing season 2. So that was, we knew, and little did I know, since it was my first show, that's very rare. Normally you do the whole season unless it's Empire or something that's obviously just eating up the world. You don't necessarily know until you've completed the season, it's completed being shown, and then they announce sometime, in the months after that. We had been given a lot of indication that we were going to get a season 3, but they didn't formally tell us until, we announced it at Comic-Con, but we had even only been told formally a few days before that. We had been kind of reassured that it was probably going to happen, but we just didn't know. It hadn't been formally done. So you're thinking anyway. I mean, a lot of these ideas, even that are in season 2, had been thought of from before season 1 was done. I mean, it's growing the whole time. But yeah, there's a party that's not totally committing to figuring it out or to figuring out how the set of plot moments you want to get to are going to actually work out until you know for sure you're going to do it.
And do you go all the way to the end? Like as a writer, do you think to yourself, okay, I know how this would end. I know where this would go if we were told next week that season 3 would be it. I know how I would tell the rest of the story.
Well, yes and no. I mean, because those are two different questions. There's the idea of like, okay, if you could if you could go for 5 years, what would that be? For 7 years versus at each point, if you're doing it right, you need to make sure that it would be a satisfying moment if that was the end, while holding, I think, in your mind several places you'd like to get. In this case, yes, we have, I think, a number of steps of those along the way, 2 of which we've already reached, the very exact moments we had pre-planned and hoped to get to. But at the same time, I'm so interested in America, as our earlier discussion shows, and in the idea of looking at our history and who we are through a supernatural and a horror lens that I would love to see, and I know Brandon has that feeling too, that who knows, we can go long enough to get through all of the witch things that we could keep going. Who knows? And meanwhile, I'm developing other things that look at very different periods or more contemporary, but that are informed by that same spirit of going, America is a landscape of horror. What if we understand what's happening here, through that lens?
Just don't let it go Carnival. Because I remember that was just heartbreaking. It was like you built this beautiful world, and then just so you guys know, you have 2 episodes to wrap it up. Yeah. And then suddenly the last 2, you're like, what the hell just happened?
That's how the American life on Mars was. I always say don't watch the American ending, watch the British one, because the American one was just like, oh, we have an episode. Okay, we're all on Mars.
Because you get so invested in TV. You get invested in the characters.
Or you get the Lost phenomenon where you sort of, is it going there or is it not? Where are they going? Did they know? Do they not know?
Big anticlimax.
And big anticlimax. And there was still lots of brilliant TV along the way to get there.
But it does cheapen it a little bit in retrospect.
Well, the one I would have liked to have seen keep going would have been Deadwood. And in some ways, I certainly try to keep in mind that experience because we often had as our notion that we would be happy if we could be like a supernatural Deadwood. Yeah. Though, fortunately, by getting a 3rd season, we can keep going past there.
But there talks yesterday, that the movie sounds like it's on track.
I love that. It's
just get Walter Hill in the saddle, and I am in. That would just be so cool. Well, I'm really excited to see season 2. You've got me chomping at the bit.
Well, I think you can see it now, probably on iTunes or Amazon, and then. Hopefully, I'm assuming it will get picked up by Netflix the way they did pick up season 1 last October. So if not before, then probably around Halloween it will show up there.
Sweet. And I know it's just a rumor, but I want to put it to rest. Some people are wanting to know, are you going to do a remake of Psyched by the 4D Witch?
I'm going to do a remake of what?
It's the single worst movie I've ever seen in my life called Psyched by the 4D Witch. It is an experience.
What is that? Where did that come from?
They claim that it was found on Manson's ranch. It's an old film, and it is the worst film ever. I'm trying to hope that it goes into the trades, like Adam Simon.
Yes, I am remaking that. Absolutely.
Okay, there you go. Any declines is Psyched by the 4D Witch. I figured it would be a good headline.
I decline to deny
what year is that film?
Like 68. It is.
But you're saying that people claim it was like found on the Spawn ranch?
I think it was Ann Timpson from the Incredible Strange Film Festival who claimed that when he played it, the one time it played, it is just it's like it is like hallucinogenic hippie footage though, and then
I love that.
Got a great theme song called "Psyched by the 4D Witch." If you can ever put that into an episode somehow,
well, you'll see. There's certainly that atmosphere is you'll see that atmosphere in season 2 because there was definitely much more getting back into some of the more psychedelic horror aspect of the 60s and 70s in that era I grew up in. It's funny. I saw a band recently. Lucifer was actually a great heavy metal show at the Echo Belly or Echo Plex, whichever one of the Echoes it was in Silver Lake, and it was Pallbearer, Lucifer, and then High on Fire. And I do take a certain amount of inspiration for horrors. I think a lot of people do from music that uses that imagery. Mm-hmm. But this band Lucifer, she's German, but she looked straight out of some late 60s, like she'd been in a Polanski movie from the late 60s. She's doing those psychedelic moves like this while they're showing like weird acidy versions of images of like Christopher Lee or Blood on Satan's Claw. So no, we like that stuff.
Now, do you ever try to grab those for the show, like those kind of tracks? I mean, you start with Marilyn Manson.
We do.
If you haven't seen the show, it opens with Marilyn. So.
Yeah, and it works really well. I'd like to actually bring more of that in there. I mean, because I think it's Tyler Bates, who co-did that song with Marilyn, who's been doing our music, has done quite a good job with a lot of that. It's interesting because there was a lot of great debate at the beginning of what are you going to do? Are you going to use period 17, when you have 17th century lute playing, or what are we going to do there? Versus not wanting to fall on something that feels like too obviously anachronistic. It's been interesting to look around at what different choices people are making. I don't know if you guys saw any of the Soderbergh early medical show.
That's our one episode of it.
And it's interesting. I mean, the direction is fantastic. Yeah. I was a bit ambivalent about some aspects of it, but I watched every single one because it's so brilliantly directed. But he made a really radical choice right from the get-go, which was he was using totally contemporary 21st century electronic music while you're wandering around late 19th century New York. And it worked. I would never have believed it worked, but it worked. Yeah. But it's also true that I'm always trying to, I am one of those writers that has to write to a soundtrack. And the soundtrack I was writing, even the original Salem and most episodes too, mixed on the one hand, yes, weird Baroque and late Baroque music and really early creepy folk songs that were sung back then, but also a lot of weird black metal and noise music. And I find a lot of... I have to kind of creep myself out.
Where's that mixtape?
It's sitting on my iTunes. We should do it. Well, actually, if you want to see some mixtapes of Salem, there's a French DJ who, for each season of Salem, has invited me and the cast to do a mixtape that you can find online. You look on my Facebook page, or I'm trying to remember what his oh God, I am losing the brain. That's what happens. Too many years of horror and the things we do to fuel the horror.
We also give you a bunch of beers, so we can blame it
the beers. I can blame it on that. But so we have actually tried to do that. But no, it comes down to this. I can't write a scary scene if I don't get a little creeped out myself when I'm doing it. And music is always a shortcut to that.
Well, Bekah, you seem to be the resident expert in the room in terms of witch movies.
Yeah, witches have always been definitely one of my favorite subgenres by far. And as I was looking at the list of my favorite witch films, I think I realized why. Because many of these I watched as a really young adolescent during my formative years. The Witches from 1990, The Worst Witch from 1986, Teen Witch from 1989
yes.
is just brilliant.
That one I know. I love it. I love Teen Witch.
Yeah, BJ Kalangia and I bond over that one.
Robin Lively.
Hocus Pocus from 1993.
Bette Midler.
Yeah. And so, and they sing this song in this movie called Come Little Children that still disturbs the shit out of me to this day. But so many of these movies that I remember just absolutely loving from my childhood, when I look back, I was like, yeah, they're all witch movies. And even my favorite TV show was Bewitched. That's the fun if you stayed home from school. From 9 a.m. to 10 was I Love Lucy, and then you got an hour of Bewitched. And then Price is Right came on for 5 hours. Right. But that was the fun of staying home from school, was seeing Bewitched. So
I love the return in your show to the because witches like the Hocus Pocus and some witches just didn't do it for me. The kind of witches that anything that was what I thought a witch would be. But when they're the old hag, especially the Pumpkinhead witch, I love that. And that creeps me out. Yeah. That just scares me because it's not the whole movie. It's just one part of the movie, and it just feels scary. And I actually thought what Rob Zombie did in Lords of Salem with the actual witch scenes. And so, there's parts of that movie that doesn't quite work, but what he did with the actual witches was great. The nudity, I felt like there's something kind of raw and,
Well,
and if you look at those...
Meg Foster.
That
was her in that movie.
And that's why I think Suspiria, granted, there's a number of reasons that
we can all agree that's the
greatest. Scary, but the witch at the end, even though you never even see her, she's just a sparkly silhouette. It's the voice. It's that you come over here.
Oh, yeah, that's
right. Voice that does
good
it
job.
for me. Yeah, thanks. I should do more voiceover work right now. But yeah, so some of the other ones that I just absolutely love from my childhood, Black Sunday.
Well, that's huge for us, and you will see again when you get around to season 2. We generally, as a rule, don't do movie nods. In part because I'm always determined not to be tongue in cheek,
right?
But it's not that there isn't humor in there. I think there's a lot of humor, but
there.
Not to. But they're layered in.
Ken Russell, The Devils, I called the first episode when I was watching it with my husband. I was like, oh, that character.
But if they're not there to be recognized as a joke, that's different. If it's not there for the audience to go, hey, it's the Devils.
It's not a reference, right? Yeah. Because part of my film with this is, unless, with the possible exception of the way it was done in the first Scream, where it didn't make it less scary. Kevin actually managed to make that referentiality make it more scary. Usually that works to make it, to me at least, less scary, because I'm not worried then if they're making references to other movies. Yeah. But we can't help but, yes, include things we love in it. And you'll see in season 2 there's a There's a big Black Sunday moment there, and both Brandon and I cherish our picture of Barbara Steele with giant holes in her face signed to each of us, because that was formative for each of us separately in our childhood too. Yeah.
And I always liked, and this one I didn't see till I was in college, and then I had a professor that, he was like, oh, you love horror, you absolutely have to watch this. Haxon from 1922.
Well, that's had a big influence for sure.
Yeah.
But that's a documentary.
Technically, yes.
Sort
it's
of.
a documentary.
That's Swedish.
Have you noticed in the documentary that the same guy plays both Jesus and the devil? It's a little confusing.
And that's Benjamin Christensen who made the movie.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is insane. He's this giant pot-bellied devil with like a tongue that would make Gene Simmons, blanch. And he's the guy making the movie. And he's like, okay, everybody relax while I take off all my clothes and now dance around like the devil.
Dance around naked. Yeah. And the women in it are naked. And but
it's a very intense.
I swear that whoever made the film which the trailer for was just released today. And Rob and I have already seen. We absolutely
How is it? How is this one?
It's amazing.
It's really cool.
It's
right,
amazing. But I swear that the guy who made that must have watched Haxon and then taken scenes directly from it, because some of the scenes of the witches running naked or what they're doing so that they can fly, that's not a spoiler. That's not a spoiler at all. But some of the scenes of the actual preparations that take place in that movie are like frame by frame Haxon, and it's beautifully done.
They might have taken it from there, but equally, a lot of those are things we touch on in Salem, because what I would say is what Christensen was the first guy to do was not to just go to fiction about witches, but to go back to what people claimed was true about them.
Yeah,
including what witches or those accused, some of them claimed they themselves were doing. And we definitely based the core of the witchcraft and the depiction of witches on the testimony, whether coerced or not, of witches and what witchfinders thought. Now, we put aside the issue of I get that. No one's going to dispute that tons of innocent people, mostly women, but not exclusively, especially in places like Germany, where it was almost 50-50 male-female, were persecuted. But there was something real going on, or at least people perceived it to be. So it sounds like these guys may have also turned to that, because when you look at Haxon, he's recreated stuff right out of these 15th, 16th, and 17th century documents. And he's also taken these prints, amazing images that were drawn in that era of what witches were up to, and directly visualized.
That's what I remember was this one wood carving showing a woman kind of, she had a baby.
Exactly.
And then the next carving or the next image, I don't even know what type of art they were, but the next image showed her almost churning it. And then the next one was her rubbing the ointment on the body. And that's supposedly how they were able to fly. But you've done that in Salem.
I do it at home all the time.
Rejuvenates the skin.
I also like saying that doesn't happen as frequently, and it creeps me out more because period, obviously, any period film, there's always a little bit more of a gap, because
of course,
in how we feel. But I Rosemary's Baby for me is really great because of the innocuous nature. It's an old woman next door and her old husband. But the one that really got me in the last 10 years was Antichrist. Was a movie that snuck up on me because I didn't know it was about a witch, kind of, and it kind of is, but it's really scary when the moments because it's about a woman and her child, and
that's right.
That film really gets me.
I had to look away though. That's one of the few movies I had to literally look away. There was things I did.
It's heavy.
That I didn't want to see.
But I feel like it's something that very few people try to contemporize. That's the witch as a fictional character, I guess.
Well, they don't work to get beyond the more received and easy image of it. And look, we can all enjoy those. And by the way, the plug I would put in for people, it's not a movie, it's a comic, but I don't know if you've seen what they're doing with Sabrina.
No.
Oh
my God.
I watched that TV show when I was a kid.
Forget the TV. Okay, I love the character. I was an Archie fan as a kid. My daughter's an Archie fan now. But somebody over at those Archie comics, they started doing grown-up horror stuff. So that Archie zombie stuff, by the way,
I hear is
really good. Yeah. Personally, okay, I'm going to say something. Well, that artist is great. Francesco
he did the best Howling poster I've ever seen.
Brilliant.
Just
and Robert Hack, who does a lot of the alternate covers for them, is the main artist on Sabrina and is amazing. And the writing is outstanding. I got to say, with all due respect to Walking Dead, the afterlife with Archie will shock you. I mean, I gotta read it. It is not done at all as a joke. It's done dead serious. It's got some humor in it, but it's scary. It's beautiful. They've done it both as a comic, but also as a creepy sized magazine in black and white, which makes it even more. And then out of the blue, they decided to take seriously the idea of Sabrina. And they're only about 3 issues into it, But each one is, I'm telling you, if you're at all a comics fan, a masterpiece of horror comics. Maybe the best horror comic I've seen in years. And it's totally, I know, who would have thought they would actually do it for real? And it's got deep Lovecraftian references in it. She gets in big trouble, actually, already. If you go back to, they got that because they spun her out of Afterlife with Archie, where she inadvertently uses her aunt's copy of the Necronomicon to bring Jughead's dog back to life. Thus, hijinks ensue. But it's great. Yeah, I love those. But I would say that, yes, that they, instead of using the movies that I think are popping out of those lists, are both contemporary ones or period ones that, how can I say it? Look, it's the same thing we did try to do, and it goes back to what we were just saying about references. You've got a choice when you're dealing with fantastical material. And it's tricky if you're a lover of the genre and a fan of the genre. Because one choice is to basically access your material through the history of the genre. The other is to say, well, but this is a set of beliefs, and to try to access the beliefs instead of the tradition of genre storytelling about it. And while we can't fully escape the genre stories that we grew up with, you will almost always renovate your story if you dig through that, if you drill deep back down through that into whatever was the presumed reality behind it. Mm-hmm. Even when we were talking about Haunting in Connecticut, that's what I tried to do, to say, well, what did people think in 1920 was possible about communicating with the dead, and how were they actually trying to do it, instead of looking at Amityville 2 or something, a movie I quite like, you know. And so similarly, to suddenly expose yourself to what was actually being said and thought and experienced by people about this archetypal image of the witch throughout history will blow your mind. And so whether it's the modern ones, which often Rosemary's Baby comes to mind, Suspiria definitely comes to mind, actually are touching on more reality than they are on genre conventions. Mm-hmm. And then there are certain period ones, which the ones that are missing from there that I would include. The non-supernatural would be Witchfinder General, for sure, of course. I
have that one on here.
But the more supernatural inclined one, and the one that I actually find stands up better in some ways than Witchfinder General, which is Blood on Satan's Claw.
Oh, see, we love that one. Elric and I do. Rob's not a fan.
How can you not? Rob, get up, leave the room.
Called out.
How can you not love Blood on Satan's Claw?
I think it was Mick Garris who I saw recently. He goes, "Oh, that movie's so terrible." Like somebody else didn't like it either.
I love that movie.
It's not released here in the U.S., so I was able to get a copy of it from overseas, and we actually took my region-free Blu-ray player to jump cut and screened it.
I do see the influence of that story on the young girls.
And I wish that was one of my frustrations. We did more with that in the second season, you'll see, in part because what I had hoped to do with that in season one did not get to fully happen. But yes, that was
the lead actress of the young ones who she's emerging
Mercy.
as. She's it's one of the best performances I've seen on TV. Of an unknown actor that's just coming up.
Look, I do think whatever else we achieve, that even if we only have 3 seasons, if we have 5, whatever it is, I think I guarantee you 10 or 20 years from now, people look back and go, oh, I can't believe all those actors were once in that show together. There's a bunch of young actors, some of whom are quasi-known, but most of whom are not really that well known. Some of whom had never been in anything major before, like Elise Eberle, who plays Mercy, who, it's stunning.
She's really good.
And
I really like the guy who played Cotton, because I watched Fringe, and it was killing me because I didn't recognize him from Fringe. I'm like, where's that guy from? But I love Fringe, and he was
okay, but wait, hang on. Do you remember, speaking of horror and non-horror shows, do you remember the whole strand in Nip Tuck? Did any of you watch Nip Tuck?
I watched all of it.
Do
you remember the son? He played the son in Nip Tuck, the doctor's son who becomes a kind of
crab boy, the one who becomes a crab boy.
Yeah, that's him too. That was his first big part. He was a brilliant young actor. Yeah,
interesting.
So some of the other contemporary witch films that we see, The Craft from 1996. Yeah. If you were a teen girl at that time, that became you watched that film in repetition.
Yeah, how long is it going to be before MTV redoes that as a show?
It's already being redone as a movie.
It's a movie.
But it's got show written all over it. I mean, a modern,
it really does. Hansel and Gretel Witch Hunters from 2013. That? I liked it, but I
like the idea.
I love the concept, but they CG'd the witches, which was really sad because what's the girl's name? Vera
Farmiga
was one of the witches, and when you have somebody like that, I think so.
She's great.
I'd laugh if this show goes without Blair Witch coming up. That would just be kind of amazing.
No, we should talk about it. Oh, but there's the Blair Witch.
It's the remnant of the witch. Everything's about the witch.
I agree. And those little things hanging. Yeah. Come on. And her standing there. We saw her in there. She's that creepy woman. She is a witch.
No one's even talked about Lady Terminator. There's a witch in Lady Terminator.
It isn't Vera Farmiga. I have to remember who the witch is in Hansel and Gretel Witch Hunters. But it's somebody that, like, I was just like, oh my gosh, when you have this person, you don't then CG the witch. I'll look
well, that's a whole other issue about the CG.
Yeah.
James Wan's work. You know, we haven't mentioned James Wan's work.
The Conjuring, I think, had some incredible
a couple
imagery.
Good
In the meantime,
scares.
let me look up who that amazing
Well, I think
witch
he
is.
has the real thing. I mean, he knows he has the genre running in his blood in a way that's allowed him. And that movie is almost like an encyclopedia. It's like you could, in a way that you could just go. He was like going to give you the best version of each of these classic.
It's like The Haunting. I remember it just felt like it was as well directed as The Haunting.
I agree. It's really hard to do. Really beautifully done.
Yeah.
And what was the surprise to me? And it's sort of a witch movie, sort of not a witch movie. That Sean Bean one during the plague,
Black Death.
Which actually
I
thought was really surprisingly good.
That was a good one.
Yeah, I don't know anything about it or who that guy was, but that one really struck me because it surprised me, and it's mixed. It goes back to our discussion. Everything goes back in circles. This goes back to we're talking about that 68 to 78 period and the grittiness of it. The horror that I love the most is gritty. What's great is those really small handful that you can say are gritty fantasy, that are going to be supernatural or touch on these more out there and metaphysical and supernatural things, but be treated in such a gritty, earthy way. Now, in that one, it's not supernatural necessarily in the end at all, but along the way, you're pretty convinced it could be, and you can taste the dirt in your mouth. I mean, it's not which also goes to your CG thing of like, that's part of why, to me, I'll just say it. CG is the death of horror. I mean, the reality is that a cheap puppet turning its head around for Friedkin in The Exorcist, imagine if he had today's technology and they had done the perfect CG 360 head spin. It would not have been scary.
You want to hear something weird? I actually
really
can connect that to, hold on just one second. I can connect that exact idea to what we were talking about last week with that uncanny valley thing.
Oh, you're right.
I wonder if looking at an android's face or a model, that weird feeling we get is the same thing we get when we look at perfect CGI.
Yeah. It's
we
totally
can't
true.
relate to it, and it feels wrong.
Or when it's, let me even take this up further. That what's the uncanny valley thing is that it inverts. So when it tries to be scary, when they show you a dragon, when they show you something impossible, you're like, oh yeah, it's just a bunch of pixels. When it gets scary is when it tries to show you a person. When it tries to actually show you normality. When it shows you Tom Hanks in the Polar Express, that's creepy.
He mentioned that. Robert Parigi, I guess, actually mentioned Tom Hanks.
That is super
because
creepy.
It just looks so artificial.
But in fact, when it's used to do the unreal and the fantastic, it just somehow triggers. I don't know. You could debate why. I'm convinced it's as simple as our limbic system, that we've got like 1 billion years of evolution, so that in a pinch we can go tiger, no tiger.
Yeah,
right. Is something in the woods or not? And even like in Carnosaur, my hand in a sock pretending to be a dinosaur, there's something there, and your limbic system jumps, so you get a jump scare. But I'm pretty convinced that even the most exquisitely, beautifully rendered set of pixels,
Mama just doesn't work.
That's right, because your limbic system says no tiger.
That was also the big problem with Hansel and Gretel Witch Hunter and the name of the head witch, the actress, and now I see why I confused it, is Famke Janssen.
Oh, who's close? Okay, I get that. You're forgiven.
It looks like someone who would appear in your show at some point.
Yes,
like Lucy Lawless instead.
But Famke Janssen is absolutely amazing, and she's scary as shit. And then they would show her transforming into the witch, and then it would just like her face would just CG, and it would be like, oh, why'd you do that? She was really good.
No, here's an archetypal witch image, for example, that's not about a witch, but that goes to heart of what you're saying. The Shining, the woman in the bathtub. The part of the essence of the witch is the movement from a beautiful naked woman to a horrible hag. And on lots of levels, on the psychosexual, who knows, archetypal, a lot of what happens with the witch thing has to do with that kind of a juxtaposition. So
did you just say the male gaze of marriage? You marry one person and you have a couple kids, and then suddenly they're wearing tracksuit pants. Hey, you old hag. Sorry, Bekah.
Tracksuit pants.
There you go.
That's it.
Too subtle.
Which, by the way, is the plot of Romero's Season of the Witch.
Yeah, I still haven't seen it.
I have to say, I'm embarrassed. I've never seen that.
The whole plot of it is this woman being incredibly suppressed. Right? It's 1972, and she's never even given a name. She's just addressed as Jack's wife the entire movie. Like she never has a character's name. And that was actually the secondary title of the movie was Jack's Wife because they thought it would sell more with the domestic markets than Season of the Witch. And
like Hollywood, Gene Dealman came out by Chantal Akerman and just ruined the whole thing.
And this surprisingly
first time Chantal Akerman or Gene Dealman has
ever been mentioned in a horror
in a context of horror. Yeah,
one person friends with good.
But in Season of the Witch, it's just this housewife who gets really bored with like her husband dragging her around, and her husband's completely bored with her because she's had kids and everything like that, and he's very just interested in his career and hanging out with his friends, and so she starts getting interested in witchcraft. And very much like Martin, if you've seen Romero's Martin, through most of the movie, you don't know if she's actually, things start happening while she's studying this witchcraft. And through much of the movie, you don't know if they're happening because she's doing them or if it's just coincidental. Right. And I won't blow the ending.
That'd be a good one to come out on Blu-ray because I feel like a lot of people haven't really discovered it.
No, I would like to. I remember always reading about it.
It's definitely a slow burn. And much of it is a domestic drama, but a lot of it's really psychedelic. Like it opens with her having a dream of wearing a dog collar and being stuck in a cage she can't get out of. And she's and it's in slow motion and she's banging on the cage and you see her husband standing off in the distance and then she wakes up. And so it's got a lot of this psychedelia in it too. So it's very kind of 1960s.
I want to watch it now.
Yeah, I'm ready. Yeah. I'm convinced.
It's funny. It's like probably the last Romero one I haven't seen to get back of the major releases.
The most people, when it came out, I don't think it got a lot of attention because it was kind of billed as Jack's Wife, and they did release it as kind of this domestic drama thing. But there was another witch film that came out, I want to say the same year, Simon, King of the Witches, which was polar opposite, gritty, very psychedelia too.
I think it's got a new release. Yeah, I think it's got a new release.
I'm pretty sure it's Prime streaming on Amazon.
Is that British?
Yeah, I thought it was.
Yeah, it might be British.
It's not American. It's definitely, I think, European.
Okay, I got to find it.
I saw an image from it recently. It was like, oh, that looks cool.
Yeah, it's gritty because it's 1971, right. But it's.
Did you guys see this? And it only touches on this tangentially, but I think picks up on, especially on this time of this one, this A Field in England.
Yeah,
I haven't seen it yet, but Ben Wheatley also Kill List, which I love, does go in that direction. Same as Very
well. And then in this one, he
does
it. Yeah, and this is even more so that way, and he's done it in widescreen, black and white, and it's in the midst of the English Civil War with an alchemist and hallucinogens and.
I would love to see him get a guest to direct an episode.
That would be amazing.
My
God. Yeah, I love that.
Perfect.
I got to mention in the context of Season of the Witch and Jack's Wife. There's because we should mention at least a few of the great novels on witches, some of which got filmed and some didn't. And one of the great ones that had a lot of influence on me was a book called Conjure Wife by Fritz Lieber, who's known as both. He was a Lovecraft acolyte and a correspondent of Lovecraft's and wrote really some of the first modern horror stories that just changed the direction out of the traditional weird tales kind of horror story and said, no. And stories like Smoke Ghost and Speak to Me Only with Thine Eyes and things like that. He took purely urban contemporary realities and made them as horrific as the old ones. So he wrote this novel, Conjure Wife, about that's really about, and in fact, I often felt that The Witches of Eastwick was kind of a rip-off of it, and no one would ever recognize how much better Lieber's novel was than Updike's, because it was also a novel about academia and about what we would think would be the territory of Updike. But an anthropology professor discovers that his wife is performing witchcraft and black magic and thinks that's obviously nuts and orders her to stop and doesn't realize that she's doing it in part because the other faculty wives are doing it. It sounds like a joke, but it's actually done really frighteningly. And it actually became I think, a pretty darn good, certainly would be on my list of 10 best witch movies. I think it's a British film with Patrick Wingard, and I think it's called Night of the Eagle.
Oh, I saw that when I was doing my research today. I just put it on
That's
Amazon.
Really worth it. It's actually an adaptation of this Fritz Lieber novel, and it's pretty good. It's not perfect, but it's pretty damn good.
It's very deterring because it's like a green cover with a woman's face and a damn eagle on it. Yes. And I was like, this doesn't look
There is no
great,
eagle. It's okay. Watch it. Yeah. Worth seeing, and based on one of the handful of great original. And I have to say, if anybody listening to this likes to read as much as they like to watch.
So those outside of LA, listen up.
Exactly. Get thee to your Amazon or to your library or to your bookstore if you're lucky enough to actually have a real one. Jeanette Winterson, who's really known as a great feminist writer, wrote a novel within the last couple of years. It didn't come out I didn't read it until we were already in the middle of the season 2. But if I had, I would have just almost laid down and wept because it did so much of what I hoped to do in Salem. It's called The Daylight Gate, and it's based in part on the reality of what happened with the Lancashire witches. And it is no doubt, we can make our list of the best witch movies. I will say Jeanette Winterson's Daylight Gate, best witch novel ever.
See, I've weirdly enough read all her books because when I first met my wife, she was into them and made me read them.
I agree.
I love them. They're the turns of phrases, but I wouldn't have expected a witch from her.
Nor would I.
Hag.
My hag. Yeah,
Your hag.
No, she's
Your
getting
hag and track.
And I'm not
hag,
my wife's a huge fan of the Orange is Not the Only Fruit and her other books, which didn't mean a lot to me. This book means everything to me. I've now read it twice. It's a great inspiration. It's sexy, truly scary. It's got history and grit and reality and some of the creepiest descriptions you'll ever read.
Oh, awesome. That's a
and
great
you know what else is really
recommendation.
great for this book? It's thin.
Yeah.
Really?
It's a better recommendation.
Wow.
And next thing you're going to say, and it's an audiobook.
With pictures.
Rob has been quiet because he said that he's not into witch films. But yesterday at the office, we were talking about The Woods.
Oh, that's right, the Lucky McKee movie.
Which kicks ass.
Yeah,
I didn't see that.
I love
I always thought it was like with the spirit light.
No, I really like. Well, but you never saw May, so to see May, and then
Right.
back
I saw
to
Woods
back-
first before I saw
Yeah, so to see them like back to back, you're like, oh, that's really interesting what he's doing. But
Yeah.
The Woods is coming out on Blu-ray from Olive.
I'd watch it
Films,
again.
So.
So the question, let me throw you guys in the question because you've been doing this. So why? And it's part of what I questioned for myself in going into Salem. Of all the big horror archetypes, it has not exactly led. I mean, we could probably list 50 great vampire movies and 50 great, or at least 35 great movies to do with, transformation of man into monster. God knows how many great ones about the human monster, the serial killer, or any number of ones. I mean, there's probably even at least 8 pretty good mummy movies. Why? Let me throw back to you guys. What is it about the witch that is hard to do or doesn't make that? And we should start with you because you're saying you have it's not something you leapt at.
No, I mean it's not that I've avoided them for any particular reason, but it's funny. It actually plays into something our guest last week was talking about. We had a filmmaker friend, Robert Peruggi, who has been championing his first script that has met resistance because it's a strong lead female character, an action character, and it's like nobody wants to, at least back then, nobody wanted to do it. Now the thing is well, no, we're going to do like Mad Max Fury.
Exactly.
So I think maybe that's it. Everything you just mentioned, vampire movies, whatever.
Ghosts, haunted houses.
I feel like anybody that might have pitched a witch story, which is like, look, this is going to be a great character piece for an amazing female actress as the lead, and they're like, nope, can't do it.
Sorry.
So maybe maybe that's why things like your show have maybe carved the way for that, because actually Janet Montgomery, by the way, her first movie is Dave Parker's The Hills Run Red.
That's right. Yeah.
And then she did Wrong Turn 3.
Wrong Turn 3.
So she kind of started in some of these horror movies. So it's great to see somebody like that.
And it's hard to when you see her. Yeah, it's incredible what she manages to do with that. That's interesting. As the resident woman here, do you agree that that's the obstacle that witch movies have to get past?
I would say that for a long time, witches kind of fell into the realm of childhood. Similar to where I think Frankenstein lived for a while. You were into witches when you were a kid. And that witches were, black pointy hats, kind of like Broomhilda. And it took a while for them to climb back out of that into something scary. But I have to say, for like me as a kid, I was fascinated by them because I think that all boys of my generation wanted to be Freddy, or you wanted to be Jason. You never wanted to fight against him. You wanted to be him. And for me, witches were the only thing that were accessible. So by the time I was in 8th grade, I was one of those weird girls reading books on witchcraft and spells and things like that, because it seemed to be not only feeding my rebellious nature, but it was the only monster or something of power, so to speak, that I thought, I could work at this and actually be this. And that was kind of badass.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because I think to
the craft fueled that.
The earliest memory of a witch is The Wizard of Oz. Like that's what you think.
Which, by the way, I hid under the table. That scared the shit out of me as a kid.
And
the Snow White image too did. And even
I think Lynch was really affected by that. I feel.
Though, and I'm old enough to that. Not only, one of my defining horror experiences as a kid was not. I knew that movie backwards and forwards. Even though back then we had no video, it was shown precisely once a year on TV, and it was a big deal. Everybody in school you knew was watching Wizard of Oz the one night of the year they showed it on TV. But I had to look away during that period. But we had this set of like LPs that were telling the Wizard of Oz, but clearly based very much using voices and stuff from the movie. And when you would start to just hear her cackle, that was it. I had to get under the table. It was held that she had a army of flying monkeys. That didn't hurt.
None of those witches were even remotely scary to me.
Then. I mean, it's funny. I hadn't thought of that until you mentioned Wizard of Oz.
It was weird. Like other things scared me, like wolves. I was scared of. Spiders scared me. Interpretations
more realistic
of
terror.
I also wonder if it was. But witches never were there. But there was one of my earliest memories was my mom bought me this record called Witch's Brew, and it had this song on there. It was like dead leaves, seaweed, rotten eggs to stir them in my witch's brew, and it was all about like a recipe. And I ended up using the song. If you watch the short that we made a couple of years ago, Witch's Brew, I used it as my closing credits. And but it was just like I always had this kind of cartoony representation of witches until I got to like 8th grade, and then they became kind of badass because I could possibly do it. But if you actually read like real like witchcraft books, they're not nearly as exciting. It's much more about like holding hands and spirituality.
And I think it could also be a couple things.
Shit.
I think historical things I could think. One, I don't think America likes to actually seriously revisit things that are actually part of its past. So I think like that's why there aren't a lot of films that are really about slavery. A lot of good horror movies that are playing a play on slavery because that part never happened. Right. And I think this is something that really happened. And I also think I'd be interested to see, but a direct correlation with the rise of feminism and not wanting to not politically correct to even portray women as witches and to like not want to touch that because of what could happen, like I just calling our wives old hags. So because I live somewhere above feminism. I'm proto-feminist. I am creator.
No, that was my biggest fear in many ways, besides just utter humiliating worldwide failure when we were doing Salem, was that people would just say, well, oh my God, you're just blaming the victim. Why don't you just go make a movie about the Holocaust in which the Jews are secretly manipulating the Nazis, And I could understand that as a reaction. I really spent an effort to kind of communicate and be in contact with people who consider themselves witches. And I come from a very feminist background, and whatever, I can make all my excuses about it. And I think that I have to say, I love to hear everything you've all said, but that is particularly key to me, what you just said, because I do feel like that our sense that women were victimized as they were under the guise of being witches, and the fact that was such a almost genocidal thing has almost blocked access to this truly powerful, important archetypal image. One of the things that first got me thinking about wanting to do something about witches, because in fact about a year before that I'd thought about doing witches. It had never occurred to me in a million years to touch it in relation to Salem for that very reason. This is part of our sacred victim history. We can't apply it to Salem because we all know, because of Arthur Miller and everybody else, that the story of Salem is of a false witch hunt. So that's just over in a separate category. But meanwhile, I was reading all this stuff about witches, in part because I'd read this cool thing where the guys we were talking about the origins of all of our horror images, our popular horror images. And it said that of all the different monsters that we have imagined, every culture's got so many different, the Japanese monsters and Korean monsters, and every culture has its monsters, that at least this anthropologist was claiming that there were only two that he felt were truly archetypal in the sense that literally every culture on Earth had imagined them. Number one was some variant and or the kind of arc that goes from the ghost to the angry dead, the walking angry dead. So that encompasses basically simply the horror of the dead, either because it's their phantasm after death or because the corpse itself arises. There's no culture that hasn't imagined that monster. To my surprise, the other one was not the vampire. It was not the shapeshifter, which is in a lot of cultures, but it was the witch. That there was no culture that hadn't imagined that. And that really got me thinking, wow, there's got to be something to that and something about what resonates in that image. But I still felt that block, which is why the key moment for me with Salem, when asked point blank, could you do it with Salem? And literally I felt like it was like, oh, duh. The only way we can do it is by saying, yeah, the witches are real, but they're the ones running the trial, so that we could preserve the idea that innocents were being killed there. Because it's clear that innocents were being killed there.
I hadn't thought about that angle.
Instead, have the whole thesis of Salem as a show is witches are real, but that they are manipulating the Puritans and the prejudice and sexism of the Puritans to use it against themselves.
As a smokescreen to keep alive.
And to ultimately commit in season 1 the necessary human sacrifices they could never get away with committing themselves. That was the only way we could get away with it.
It reminds me how Fulci opens City of the Living Dead with a priest hanging himself.
Exactly.
It has that same kind of circle. This was a great conversation. Yeah, I've got to say we've had a couple of really good ones in the last couple weeks. Yeah. This has got to be one of the best horror conversations I've had. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
What a pleasure. Thank you.
We have been, while talking, eating chocolate cupcakes from Porto's because it's Rob's birthday.
It was last week. Technically last week.
But it was like it fell over the weekend. And we didn't want to do it before your birthday, so we're doing it afterwards.
I'm okay with it.
It's the Rob G month. So happy birthday, Rob.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Adam, for coming. And
pleasure.
and we'll see you next week.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, guys. Bye.